Chapter 16 of Five Little Peppers at School by Margaret Sidney. Chapter 16 New Plans. "Polly," said Jasper, "could you come into the den?" "Why, yes, Jasper," she cried, in surprise at his face. "Oh, has anything happened?" "No," he said, but the gloomy look did not disappear. "Oh, Polly, it's too bad to ask. Were you going to study?" with a glance at her armful of books. "No, that is, I can do them just as well after dinner." Polly dropped her books on the hall chair. "Oh, what is it, Jasper?" running after him into the den. "It's just this, Polly, I hate to tell you." He paused, and gloom settled worse than ever over his face. "Jasper," said Polly quite firmly, as she laid her hand on his arm, "I really think you ought to tell me right away what is on your mind." "Do you really, Polly?" Jasper asked eagerly. "Yes, I do," said Polly, "unless you'd rather tell Mamsie. Perhaps that would be best, Jasper." "No, I don't think it really would in this case, Polly. I will tell you." So he drew up a chair, and Polly settled into it, and he perched on the end of the table. "You see, Polly," he began, "I hate to tell you, but if I don't, why, of course you can't in the least understand how to help." "No, of course I can't," said Polly, clasping her hands together tightly, and trying to wait patiently for the recital. Oh, what could it be? "Well, Pickering isn't doing well at school," said Jasper in a burst. It was so much better to have it out at once. "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Polly in sorrow. "No, he isn't," said Jasper decidedly. "It grows worse and worse." "Dear me!" said Polly again. "And now Mr. Faber says there isn't much hope for him unless he picks up in the last half. He called me into his study to tell me that to-day. Wants me to influence him and all that." All the hateful story was out at last. Polly sprang out of her chair. "You can't mean that Pickering will be dropped, Jasper?" she cried as she faced him. "Worse than that," answered Jasper gloomily. "Worse than dropped!" exclaimed Polly, with wide eyes. "To be dropped a class wouldn't kill Pick. So many boys have had that happen, although that is quite bad enough." "I should think so," breathed Polly. "But Pick will simply be shot out of the school," said Jasper desperately. "There's no use in mincing matters. Mr. Faber has utterly lost patience, and the other teachers as well." "You don't mean that Pickering Dodge will be expelled?" cried Polly in a little scream. "Yes." Jasper nodded his head, unable to utter another word. Then he sprang off from the table end, and walked up and down the room, as Polly sank back in her chair. "You see, it's just this way, Polly," he cried. "Pick has had warning after warning. You know the teachers have a system of sending written warnings around to the boys when they fall behind in their work, and he hasn't paid any attention to them." "Won't he pay any attention to what the teachers write to him, Jasper?" asked Polly, leaning forward in her big chair to watch him anxiously as he paced back and forth. "No, calls them rubbish, and tears them up, and sometimes he won't even read them," said Jasper. "Oh, it's awful, Polly!" "I should say it was," said Polly slowly. "Very awful indeed, Jasper." "And the last time he had one from Herr Frank about his German, Pick brought it into the room where a lot of us boys were, and read it out, with no end of fun over it, and it went to the scrap basket, and he hasn't tackled his grammar a bit better since, only the translations he's up a trifle on." "Oh, now I know why you wouldn't go to ride with me for the last week," cried Polly, springing out of her chair to rush up to him. "You've been helping Pickering," she declared with kindling eyes. "Never mind," said Jasper uneasily. "And it was splendid of you," cried Polly, the color flying over her cheeks. "Oh, Jasper, I do believe you can pull him through." "No, I can't, Polly." Jasper stood quite still. "No one can pull him through but you, Polly." "I!" exclaimed Polly in amazement. "Why, Jasper King!" and she tumbled back a few steps to stare at him. "What do you mean?" "It's just this way." Jasper threw back his hair from his hot forehead. "Pick doesn't care a bit for what I say. It's an old story, goes in at one ear and out at the other." "Oh, he does care for what you say," contradicted Polly stoutly. "Ever and ever so much, Jasper." "Well, he's heard it so much, perhaps I've pounded at him too hard. And then again—" Jasper paused and turned away a bit, and rushed back hastily with vexation written all over his face. "I must speak it. I can't help him any more, for somehow Mr. Faber has found it out, and forbids it. That's one reason of the talk this morning in his study. Says I must influence him and all that. That's rubbish. I can't influence him." Jasper dashed over to lay his head on the table on his folded arms. "Polly, if Pick is expelled, He couldn't finish it, his voice breaking all up. Polly ran over to lay a hand on his shaking shoulders. "What can I do, Jasper?" she cried brokenly. "Tell me and I'll do it, every single thing." "You must talk to him," said Jasper, raising his head. It filled Polly with dismay to see his face. "Get him in here. I'll bring him over and then clear out of the den." "Oh, Jasper!" exclaimed Polly, quite aghast. "I couldn't talk to Pickering Dodge. Why, he wouldn't listen to me." "Yes, he would," declared Jasper eagerly. "He thinks everything of you, Polly, and if you'll say the word, it will do more good than anything else." "Do, Polly," he begged. "But Jasper," began Polly, a little white line coming around her mouth, "what would he think to have me talk to him about his lessons?" "Think?" repeated Jasper. "Why, he'd like it, Polly, and it will be the very thing that will help him." "Oh, I can't!" cried Polly, twisting her fingers. Then she broke out passionately. "Oh, he ought to be ashamed of himself not to study, and there's that nice Mr. Cabot, and his aunt." "Aunt!" exclaimed Jasper explosively. "Polly, I do believe if he hadn't her picking at him all the time, he would try harder." "Well, his uncle is different," said Polly, her indignation by no means dying out. "Yes, but it's his aunt who makes the mischief. Honestly, Polly, I don't believe I could stand her," said Jasper in a loyal burst. "No, I don't believe I could, either," confessed Polly. "And you see, when a boy has such a home, no matter what they give him, why, he doesn't have the ambition that he would if things were different. Just think, Polly, not to have one's own father or mother." "Oh, Jasper!" cried Polly, quite overcome. "I'll do it, I will." "Polly!" Jasper seized her hands and held them fast, his dark eyes glowing. "Oh, Polly, that's so awfully good of you." "And you'd better run over and get him now," said Polly, speaking very fast, "or I may run away, I'll get so scared." "You won't run away, I'll be bound," cried Jasper, bursting into a merry laugh, and rushing off with a light heart. And presently, in less time than one could imagine, though to Polly it seemed an age, back he came, Pickering with him, all alive with curiosity to know what Polly Pepper wanted of him. "It's about the play, I suppose," he began, lolling into an easy chair. "Jasper wouldn't tell me what it's all about, only seized me by the ear and told me to come on. Draw up your chair, Jasper, and why, hello, where is the chap?" swinging his long figure around to stare. "Pickering," began Polly, and the den, usually the pleasantest place in all the house, was now like a prison, whose walls wouldn't let her breathe. "I don't know what to say. Oh, dear me!" Poor Polly could get no further, but sat there in the hopeless misery, looking at him. What? Oh, beg pardon!" exclaimed Pickering, whirling back in his chair. "But things are so very queer. First Jasper rushes off like a lunatic." "And I'm worse," said Polly, at last finding her tongue. "I don't wonder you think it's queer, Pickering, but Jasper does so love you, and it will just kill him if you don't study." It was all out now, and in the most dreadful way. And feeling that she had quite destroyed all hope, Polly sat up pale and stiff in her chair. Pickering threw his long figure out of the easy chair, rushed up and down the den with immense strides, and came back to stand directly in front of her. "Do you mean it, Polly?" His long face was working badly, and his hands were clenched, but as they were thrust deep within his pockets, Polly couldn't see them. "Yes," said Polly, "I do, Pickering." He stalked off again, but was back once more. Polly wondering how she could possibly bear to tell Jasper of her failure, for of course Pickering was very angry, when he said, "Polly, I want to tell you something." "What is it?" Polly looked at him sharply, and caught her breath. "I won't drag Jasper down, I tell you, with me. I'll get through somehow at school, I promise you that. Here!" He twitched out his right hand from its pocket, and thrust it out at her. "Oh, Pickering Dodge!" exclaimed Polly in a transport, and seizing his hand, it was shaken vigorously. "There, that's a bargain," declared Pickering solemnly. "I'll get through some way. And say, Polly, it was awfully good of you to speak." "It was awfully hard," said Polly, drawing a long breath. "Oh, you're sure you're not vexed, Pickering? Very sure?" And Polly's face drooped anxiously. "Vexed?" cried Pickering. "I should rather say not, Polly. I'm lazy and selfish and good for nothing, but I couldn't be vexed, for 'twas awfully hard for you to do." "I guess it was," said Polly. Then she gave a little laugh, for it was all bright and jolly again, and she knew that Pickering would keep his word. And that evening, after Jasper and she had a dance, they were so happy they couldn't keep still, in the wide hall, Jasper burst out suddenly with a fresh idea. "Polly," he said, drawing her off to rest on one of the high carved chairs, "there's one more thing." "Oh, what is it, Jasper?" she cried gaily, with flushed cheeks. "Oh, wasn't that spin just delicious?" "Wasn't it?" cried Jasper heartily. "Well now, Polly," flinging himself down on the next chair, "it's just this. Do you know, I don't believe we ought to have our play." "Not have our play?" Polly peered around to look closely into his face. "What do you mean, Jasper?" "You see, Polly, Pick was to take a prominent part, and he ought not to, you know; it will take him from his lessons to rehearse and all that. And he's so backward there's a whole lot for him to make up." "Well, but Pickering will have to give up his part then," said Polly decidedly, "for we've simply got to have that play, to get the money to help that poor brakeman's family." Jasper winced. "I know, we must earn it somehow," he said. "We must earn it by the play," said Polly. "And besides, Jasper, we voted at the club meeting to have it. So there now," she brought up triumphantly. "We could vote to rescind that vote," said Jasper. "Well, we don't want to. Why, Jasper, how that would look on our 2 record books!" said Polly in surprise, for Jasper was so proud of his club and its records. "Yes, of course, as our 2 clubs united that evening, it must go down in both books," said Jasper slowly. "Yes, of course," assented Polly happily. "Well, now, you see, Jasper, that we really can't give it up, for we've gone too far. Pickering will have to let someone else take the part of the chief brigand." For the little play was almost all written by Polly's fingers, Jasper filling out certain parts when implored to give advice, and brigands, and highway robberies, and buried treasures, and rescued maidens, and gallant knights, figured generously, in a style to give immense satisfaction. "And the play is so very splendid!" cried Jasper. "Oh dear me, what ought we to do, Polly?" He buried his face in his hands a moment. "Pickering must give up his part," said Polly again. "But Polly, you know he has been in all our plays," said Jasper. "And you feel so badly, and now he's got all this trouble about his lessons on his mind," and Jasper's face fell. Polly twisted uncomfortably on her chair. "Oh dear me," she began, "I suppose we must give it up." "And if we gave it up, not altogether, but put it off till he catches up on his studies," suggested Jasper, "why, he wouldn't be dropped out." "But the poor brakeman's family, Jasper," said Polly, puzzled that Jasper should forget the object of the play. "Oh, I didn't mean that we should put off earning the money, Polly," cried Jasper, quite horrified at such a thought. "We must do something else, so that we can sell just as many tickets." "But what will it be?" asked Polly, trying not to feel crushed, and sighing at the disappearance of the beautiful play, for a time at least. "Well, we could have recitations for one thing," said Jasper, feeling dreadfully to see Polly's disappointment, and concealing his own, for he had set his heart on the play too. "Oh dear me!" exclaimed Polly, wrinkling up her face in disdain. "Jasper, do you know, I am so tired of recitations." "So am I." Jasper bobbed his head in sympathy. "But we boys have some new ones, learned for last exhibition, so Pick won't have to take a moment from his lessons. And then we can have music, and you will play, Polly." "Oh, Jasper, I've played so much," said Polly. "They're all tired of hearing me." "They never would be tired of hearing you, Polly," said Jasper simply. "Every one of us thinks you play beautifully." "And tableaux and operetta take just as much time to rehearse," mused Polly, thinking very hard if there wasn't something to keep them from the dreaded recitations. "And I just loathe an operetta or tableaux!" exclaimed Jasper, with such venom that Polly burst out laughing. "Oh, Jasper, if you could see your face!" she cried. "I shouldn't want to," he laughed too. "But of all insipid things an operetta is the worst, and tableaux, the way Miss Montague drilled and drilled and drilled us, and then stuck us up like 2 sticks not to move for half an hour, so nearly finished me." "So it did me," confessed Polly. "And besides, it would take a great deal more time to go through all that drilling than to rehearse the play." "Of course it would," said Jasper. "So tableaux, thank fortune, are not to be thought of. I think it will have to be recitations and music, Polly." "I suppose so," she said with a sigh. "Oh, Jasper!" Then she sprang off from her chair and clapped her hands. "I've thought of the very thing. I believe Mr. Hamilton Dyce would tell some of his funny stories, and help out the program." "Capital!" shouted Jasper, and just at this moment the big front door opened, and the butler ushered in Miss Mary Taylor and Mr. Dyce. Polly and Jasper rushed up to the visitors, for they were prime favorites with the young people, and precipitated upon them all their woes. The end was that they both promised beautifully to do whatever was wanted, for Miss Mary Taylor sang delightfully. "And Pickering is safe, Polly, for I know now he'll go through the last half," cried Jasper as they ran off to study their lessons for the next day. Chapter 17 of Five Little Peppers at School by Margaret Sidney. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17 Phronsie. And after that, there was no more trouble about that program, for as luck would have it, the very next day a letter came from Joel, saying that Dr. Marks had given them a holiday of a week on account of the illness of 2 boys in their dormitory, and "May I bring home Tom Beresford? He's no end fine," and "Please, Mamsie, let me fetch Sinbad. Do telegraph yes." And Mother Fisher, after consultation with Mr. King, telegraphed yes, and wild was the rejoicing over the return of Joel and David and Percy and Van, and Tom, for Mother Fisher was ready to receive with open arms, and very glad silently to watch, one of Joel's friends. "And to think that Sinbad is coming!" cried Polly, dancing about. "Just think, Phronsie, Joel's dear dog that Dr. Marks let him take to the little cobbler to keep for him." And she took Phronsie's hand, and they spun around the hall. "I shall get him a new pink ribbon," declared Phronsie breathlessly, when the spin was over. "Do!" cried Polly. "Dear me, that was a good spin, Phronsie." "I should think it was," said Ben. "Goodness me, Polly, Phronsie and you made such a breeze." "Didn't we, Pet?" cried Polly, with a last kiss. "Oh, Ben and Jasper, to think those boys will be here for our entertainment." "I know Tom is made of the right stuff," Mamsie said proudly to Father Fisher, "else my boy would not choose him." "That's a fact, wife," the little doctor responded heartily. "Joel's all right, maybe a bit heedless, but he has a good head on his shoulders." The 5 boys bounded into the wide hall that evening, Joel first, and in his arms a yellow dog, by no means handsome, with small beady eyes, and a stubby tail that he was violently endeavoring to wag, under the impression that he had a good deal of it. "Mamsie!" shouted Joel, his black eyes glowing, and precipitating himself into her arms, dog and all. "See Sinbad! See, Mamsie!" "It's impossible not to see him," said Ben. "Goodness me, Joe, what a dog!" Which luckily Joel did not hear, for the babble going on around. Besides, there was Phronsie trying to put her arms around the dog, and telling him about the pink ribbon which she held in her hand. "Joe," said Dr. Fisher, who had been there and everywhere in the group, and coming up to nip Joel's jacket, "introduce your friend. You're a pretty one, to bring a boy home and—" "I forgot you, Tom," shouted Joel, starting off, still hanging to his dog. "Oh, there you are!" seeing Tom in the midst of the circle, and talking away to Grandpapa and Polly. "As if I couldn't introduce Tom!" sniffed Percy importantly, quite delighted at Joel's social omissions. "I've done it ages ago." "All right," said Joel, quite relieved. "Oh, Phronsie, Sinbad doesn't want that ribbon on," as Phronsie was making violent efforts to get it around the dog's neck. "I would let her, Joel," said Mother Fisher, "if I were you." "But he hates a ribbon," said Joel in disgust, "and besides, he'll chew it up, Phronsie." "I don't want him to chew it up, Joel," said Phronsie slowly, and pausing in her endeavors, and she looked very sober. "I'll tell you, Phronsie." Mrs. Fisher took the pink satin ribbon that Phronsie had bought with her own money. "Now, do you want Mother to tie it on?" "Do, Mamsie," begged Phronsie, smoothing her gown in great satisfaction. And presently there was a nice little bow standing up on the back of Sinbad's neck, and there didn't seem to be any ends to speak of. There was nothing to distract his attention from the responsibility of watching all the people. "Oh, isn't he beautiful!" cried Phronsie in a transport, and hopping up and down to clap her hands. "Grandpapa dear, do look! And I've told Princey all about him, and given him a ribbon too, so he won't feel badly." And after this excitement had died down, Joel whirled around. "Tom's brought his banjo," he announced. "Oh!" exclaimed Polly. "And he can sing," cried Joel, thinking it best to mention all his accomplishments at once. "Don't, Joe," begged Tom, twitching his sleeve. Polly looked over at Jasper with sparkling eyes, and the color flew into her cheeks. "Splendid," his eyes signaled back. "What is it?" cried Joel, giving each a sharp glance. "Now you two have secrets, and that's mean when we've just got home. What is it, Polly?" He ran to her, shaking her arm. "You'll see in time," said Polly, shaking him off to dance away. "I don't want to know in time," said Joel. "I want to know now. Mamsie, what is it?" "I'm sure I haven't the least idea," said Mother Fisher, who hadn't heard Joel's announcement. "And I think you would do better, Joey, to take care of your guest and let other things wait." "Oh, Tom doesn't want to be fussed over," said Joel carelessly, yet he went back to the tall boy standing quite still in the midst of the general hilarity. "That's just the way Ben and Polly used to do in the little brown house," he grumbled, "always running away and hiding their old secrets from me, Tom." "Well, we had to, if we ever told each other anything," said Ben coolly. "Joel everlastingly tagged us about, Beresford." "Well, I had to, if I ever heard anything," burst out Joel with a laugh. "Come on, Tom," and he bore him off together with Sinbad. "Polly," Jasper was saying, the two now being off in a corner, "how fine! Now perhaps Tom Beresford will sing." "And play," finished Polly with kindling face. "Oh, Jasper, was anything ever so gorgeous?" she cried joyfully, for Polly dearly loved high sounding words. "And we'll sell a lot more tickets, because he's new, and people will want to hear him." "If he will do it," said Jasper slowly, not wanting to dampen her anticipation, but dreadfully afraid that the new boy might not respond. "Oh, he'll do it, I believe," declared Polly confidently. "He must, Jasper, help about that poor brakeman's family." And he did. Tom Beresford evidently made up his mind, when he went home with Joel, to do everything straight through that the family asked him, for he turned out to be the best visitor they had entertained, and one and all pronounced him capital. All but Joel himself, who told him very flatly the second day that he wasn't half as nice as at school, for he was now running at everybody's beck and nod. "Instead of yours," said Tom calmly. Then he roared. "Hush up!" cried Joel, very uncomfortable and getting very red. "Well, you must acknowledge, Tom, that I want to see something of you, else why would I have brought you home, pray tell?" "Nevertheless, I shall do what your sister Polly and your mother and Jasper and Mr. King ask me to," said Tom composedly, which was all Joel got for his fuming. And the most that he saw of Tom after that was a series of dissolving views, for even Phronsie began to monopolize him, being very much taken with his obliging ways. At last Joel took to moping, and Ben found him thus in a corner. "See here, old fellow, that's a nice way, to come home on a holiday and have such a face. I don't wonder you want to sneak in here." "It's pretty hard," said Joel, trying not to sniffle, "to have a fellow you brought home from school turn his back on you." "Well, he couldn't turn his back on you," said Ben, wanting very much to laugh, but he restrained himself, "if you went with him." "I can't follow him about," said Joel in a loud tone of disgust. "He's twanging his old banjo all the time, and Polly's got him to sing, and he's practicing up. I wish 'twas smashed." "What?" said Ben, only half comprehending. "Why, his old banjo. I didn't think he'd play it all the time," said Joel, who was secretly very proud of his friend's accomplishments, and he displayed a very injured countenance. "See here now, Joe," said Ben, laying a very decided hand on Joel's jacket, "do you just drop all this, and come out of your hole. Aren't you ashamed, Joe? Run along and find Beresford, and pitch into whatever he's doing." "I can't do anything for that old concert," said Joel, who obeyed enough to come out of the old hole, but stood glancing at Ben with sharp black eyes. "I don't know about that," said Ben. "You can at least help to get the tickets ready." "Did Polly say so?" demanded Joel, all in a glow. "Say, Ben, did she?" advancing on him. "No, but I do, for Polly asked me to do them, and you know, Joe, I'm busy all day." He didn't say how tired, also, but Joel knew how Ben was working at Cabot and Van Meter's, hoping to get into business life the sooner, to begin to pay Grandpapa back for all his kindness. "Ben, if I can help you with those tickets, I'll do it." Every trace of Joel's grumpiness had flown to the four winds. "Let me, will you?" he begged eagerly. "All right." Ben had no need to haul him along, as Joel raced on ahead up to Ben's room to get the paraphernalia. "I can't think what's become of Joel," said Polly, flying down the long hall in great perplexity. "We want him dreadfully. Have you seen him, Phronsie?" "No," said Phronsie, "I haven't, Polly," and a look of distress came into her face. "Never mind, pet," said Polly, her brow clearing. "I'll find him soon." But Phronsie watched Polly fly off with a troubled face. Then she said to herself, "I ought to find Joey for Polly," and started on a tour of investigation to suit herself. Meanwhile Ben was giving Joel instructions about the tickets, and Joel presently was so absorbed he wouldn't have cared if all the Tom Beresfords in the world had deserted him, as he bent over his task, quite elated that he was helping Polly, and becoming one of the assistants to make the affair a success. "I guess it's going to be a great thing, Ben," he said, looking up a moment from the pink and yellow pasteboard out of which he was cutting the tickets. "You better believe so," nodded Ben, hugely delighted to see Joe's good spirits, when the door opened and in popped Phronsie's yellow head. She ran up to Joel. "Oh, Joey," she hummed delightedly, "I've found you," and threw herself into his arms. Joel turned sharply, knife in hand. It was all done in an instant. Phronsie exclaimed, "Oh!" in such a tone that Ben, off in the corner of the room, whirled around to see Joel, white as a sheet, holding Phronsie. "I've killed her!" he screamed. Ben sprang to them. The knife lay on the table, where Joel had thrown it, a little red tinge along the tip. Ben couldn't help seeing it as he dashed by with a groan. "Give her to me," he commanded hoarsely. "No, no, I'll hold her," persisted Joel, through white lips and hanging to Phronsie. "Give her to me, and run down for Father Fisher." "It doesn't hurt much, Joey," said Phronsie, holding up her little arm. A small stream of blood was flowing down, and she turned away her head. Joel took one look and fled with wild eyes. "I don't believe it's very bad," Ben made himself call after him hoarsely. "Now, Phronsie, you'll sit in my lap, there, and I'll keep this old cut together as well as I can. We must hold your arm up so, child." Ben made himself talk as fast as he could to keep Phronsie's eyes on him. "I got cut in the little brown house once, didn't I, Bensie?" said Phronsie, trying to creep up farther into Ben's lap. "You must sit straight, child," said Ben. Oh, would Father Fisher and Mamsie ever come, for the blood, despite all his efforts, was running down the little arm pretty fast. "Why, Ben?" asked Phronsie, with wide eyes, and wishing that her arm wouldn't ache so, for now quite a smart pain had set in. "Why, Bensie?" and thinking if she could be cuddled it wouldn't be quite so bad. "Why, we must hold your arm up stiff," said Ben, just as Mamsie came up to her baby and took her in her arms, and then Phronsie didn't care whether the ache was there or not. "Joe couldn't help it," said Ben brokenly. "I believe that," Mother Fisher said firmly. "Oh, Ben, the doctor is away." Ben started. "I'll go down to the office, perhaps he's there." "No, there's no chance. I've sent for Dr. Pennell. Your father likes him. Now, Phronsie," Mrs. Fisher set her white lips together tightly, "you and I and Ben will see to this arm of yours. Ben, get one of your big handkerchiefs." "It doesn't ache so very much, Mamsie," said Phronsie, "only I would like to lay it down." "And that is just what we can't do, Phronsie," said Mother Fisher decidedly. "All right," to Ben, "now tear it into strips." Old Mr. King was not in the library when Joel had rushed down with his dreadful news, but was in Jasper's den, consulting with him and Polly about the program for the entertainment, as Polly and Jasper, much to the old gentleman's delight, never took up a step without going to him for advice. The consequence was that these three did not hear of the accident till a little later, when the two Whitney boys dashed in with pale faces. "Phronsie's hurt!" was their announcement, which wouldn't have been given so abruptly had not each one been so anxious to get ahead of the other. Old Mr. King, not comprehending, had turned sharply in his chair to stare at them. "Hush, boys!" warned Polly, hoarsely pointing to him. "Is Mamsie with her?" She didn't dare to speak Phronsie's name. "Yes," said Van, eager to communicate all the news, and hoping Percy would not cut in. But Percy, after Polly's warning, had stood quite still, afraid to open his mouth. Jasper was hunting in one of his drawers for an old book his father had wished to see, so of course he hadn't heard a word. "Here it is, Father!" he cried, rushing back and whirling the leaves. "Why, what?" for he saw Polly's face. "Oh, Jasper, don't!" said Polly brokenly. "Why do you boys rush in this manner?" demanded old Mr. King testily. "And Polly, child, what is the matter?" "Grandpapa," cried Polly, rushing over to him, put her arms around his neck. "Phronsie's hurt some way. I don't believe it is much," she gasped, while Jasper ran to his other side. "Phronsie hurt!" cried old Mr. King in sharp distress. "Where is she?" Then Percy, seeing it was considered time for communication of news, struck in boldly, and between the two all that was known of Joel's wild exclamations was put before them. All this was told along the hall and going over the stairs, for Grandpapa, holding Polly's hand, with Jasper hurrying fast behind them, was making good time up to Ben's room. "And Dr. Fisher can't be found," shouted Van, afraid that the whole would not be told. Polly gave a shiver that all her self-control could not help. "But Joel's gone for Dr. Pennell," screamed Percy. "Mrs. Fisher sent him." "He's very good," said Jasper comfortingly. So this is the way they came into Ben's room. "Oh, here's Grandpapa," cooed Phronsie, trying to get down from Mamsie's lap. "Oh, no, Phronsie," said Mrs. Fisher. "You must sit still; it's better for your arm." "But Grandpapa looks sick," said Phronsie. "Bless me! Oh, you poor lamb, you!" Old Mr. King went unsteadily across the room and knelt down by her side. "Grandpapa," said Phronsie, stroking his white face, "see, it's all tied up high." "Sit still, Phronsie," said Mrs. Fisher, keeping her fingers on the cut. Would the doctor ever come? Besides, Joel, Thomas, and several more messengers were dispatched with orders for Dr. Pennell, and to find Dr. Fisher, with the names of the other doctors, if these failed. God would send one of them soon, she knew. Phronsie obediently sat quite still, although she longed to show Grandpapa the white bandages drawn tightly around her arm, and she smoothed his hair, while he clasped his hands in her lap. "I want Polly," she said presently. "Stay where you are, Polly," said her mother, who had telegraphed this before with her eyes, over Phronsie's yellow hair. Polly, at the sound of Phronsie's voice, had leaned forward, but now stood quite still, clasping her hands tightly together. "Speak to her, Polly," said Jasper. But Polly shook her head, unable to utter a sound. "Polly, you must," said Jasper, for Phronsie was trying to turn in her mother's lap, and saying in a worried way, "Where's Polly? I want Polly." "Polly is over there," said Mamsie, "but I do not think it is best for her to come now. But she'll speak to you, Phronsie." "How funny!" laughed Phronsie. "Polly can't come, but she'll talk across the room." Everything turned black before Polly's eyes, but she began, "Yes, Pet, I'm here," very bravely. "I'm so glad that you're there, Polly," said Phronsie, easily satisfied. Footsteps, rapid and light, were heard on the stairs. Polly and Jasper flew away from the doorway to let Dr. Pennell, his little case in his hand, come in. "Well, well," he exclaimed cheerily, "so now it's Phronsie. I'm coming to her this time," for he had often dropped in to call or to dine since the railway accident. "Yes," said Phronsie, with a little laugh of delight, for she very much liked Dr. Pennell. He always took her on his lap, and told her stories, and he had a way of tucking certain little articles in his pockets to have her hunt for them. So they had gotten on amazingly well. "Why, where—" Phronsie began in a puzzled way. "Is Dr. Fisher?" Dr. Pennell finished it for her, rapidly going on with his work. "Well, he'll be here soon, I think. And you know he always likes me to do things when he isn't on hand, so I've come." "And I like you very much," said Phronsie, wriggling her toes in satisfaction. "I know that. We are famous friends, Phronsie," said the doctor, with one of those pleasant smiles of his that showed his white teeth. "What's famous?" asked Phronsie, keeping her grave eyes on his face. "Oh, fine. It means first rate. We are fine friends, aren't we, Phronsie?" "Yes, we are," declared Phronsie, bending forward to see his work the better, and taking her eyes from his face. "There, there, you must sit quite straight. That's a nice child, Phronsie. And see here, I must take you sometime in my carriage when I go on my calls. Will you go, Phronsie?" And Dr. Pennell smiled again. "Yes, I will." Phronsie nodded her yellow head, while she fastened her eyes on his face. "I used to go with Papa Fisher when I was at the little brown house, and I liked it, I did." "Well, and now you will go with me," laughed Dr. Pennell. "Now, Phronsie, I think you are fixed up quite nicely," slipping the various articles he had used deftly into his little bag, and snapping it to. "Not a very bad affair," he said, whirling round to old Mr. King, drawn deeply within a big chair, having already telegraphed the same to Mother Fisher over Phronsie's head. "Thank the Lord!" exclaimed the old gentleman. "Well, now, I'm going to send every one out of the room," announced Dr. Pennell, authoritatively. "Hurry now." He clapped his hands and laughed. Old Mr. King sat quite still, fully determined not to obey. But the doctor, looking over him fixedly, seemed to expect him to leave, and although he still had that pleasant smile, he didn't exactly give the impression that his medical authority could be tampered with. So the old gentleman found himself outside of the door. "And now we must find Joel," Polly was saying to Jasper. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of 5 Little Peppers at School by Margaret Sidney. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18 Tom's Story. Joel had no cause to complain now that Tom Beresford did not stick to him, for there he was hanging over him as he crouched into as small a heap as possible into a corner of Mamsie's sofa. And there he had been ever since Joel had rushed in with Dr. Pennell, when, not daring to trust himself up in Ben's room, he had dashed for refuge to Mamsie's old sofa. Tom had not wasted many words, feeling sure under similar circumstances he shouldn't like to be talked to, but he had occasionally patted Joel's stubby head in a way not to be misunderstood, and once in a while Joel thrust out a brown hand which Tom had gripped fast. "It's all right, old boy, I verily believe," Tom cried with sudden energy, "so brace up. What's the use of your going to pieces, anyway?" "It's Phronsie," gasped Joel, and burrowing deeper into the cushion. "Well, I know it," said Tom, gulping down his sorrow, for he had petted Phronsie a good deal, so he was now feeling the blow quite sharply himself. "But you won't help matters along any, I tell you, by collapsing." "Go out into the hall, will you, Tom?" begged Joel, huddling down, unwilling to listen himself, "and see if you can hear anything." So Tom, skipping out into the wide upper hall, thankful for any action, but dreading the errand, stole to the foot of the stairs and craned his ear to catch the faintest sound from above. There was only a little murmur, for Dr. Pennell was in the midst of operations, and not enough to report. Thankful that it was no worse, Tom skipped back. "All's quiet along the Potomac." "Ugh!" exclaimed Joel, burrowing deeper. Suddenly he threw himself up straight and regarded Tom out of flashing eyes. "I've killed Phronsie," he cried huskily, "and you know it, and won't tell me." "Joel Pepper!" cried Tom, frightened half out of his wits, and rushing to him. "Lie down again," laying a firm hand on his shoulder. "I won't!" roared Joel wildly, and shaking him off. "You're keeping something from me, Tom." "You're an idiot," declared Tom, thinking it quite time to be high-handed. "A first-class, howling idiot, Pepper, to act so. If you don't believe me when I say I haven't anything to keep back from you, I'll go straight upstairs. Someone will tell me." "Hurry along," cried Joel feverishly. But Tom had gotten no further than the hall when Joel howled, "Come back, Tom, I'll try to bear it." And Tom flying back, Joel was buried as far as his face went, in Mamsie's cushion, sobbing as if his heart would break. "It will disturb them," he said gustily, in between his sobs. Tom Beresford let him cry on, and thrust his hands in his pockets to stalk up and down the room. He longed to whistle, to give vent to his feelings, but concluding that wouldn't be understood, but be considered heartless, he held himself in check and counted the slow minutes, for this was deadly tiresome, and beginning to get on his nerves. "I shall screech myself before long, I'm afraid." At last Joel rolled over. "Come here, do, Tom," and when Tom got there, glad enough to be of use, Joel pulled him down beside the sofa and gripped him as only Joel could. "Do you mind, Tom? I want to hang on to something." "No, indeed," said Tom heartily, vastly pleased, although he was nearly choked. "Now you're behaving better." He patted him on the back. "Hark, Joe, the doctor's laughing." They could hear it distinctly now, and as long as he lived, Joel thought, he never heard a sweeter sound. He sprang to his feet, upsetting Tom, who rolled over on his back to the floor. Just then in rushed Polly and Jasper, surrounding him, and in a minute, "Oh, is Tom sick?" "No," said Tom, picking himself up grimly, "only Joe's floored me, he was so glad to hear the doctor laugh." "Oh, you poor, poor boy!" Polly was mothering Joel now, just as Mamsie would have done, and Tom looking on with all his eyes, as he thought of his own home, with neither mother nor sister, didn't hear Jasper at first. So Jasper pulled his arm. "See here, Beresford, you and I will go down to the library, I think." "All right," said Tom, allowing himself to be led off, though he would much have preferred remaining. "Now, Joel," said Polly, after they had gone, and the petting had continued for some minutes, "you must be a brave boy, and please Mamsie, and stop crying," for Joel had been unable to stop the tears. I didn't see Phronsie coming," wailed Joel afresh. "Of course you didn't," said Polly, stroking his black curls. "Why, Joey Pepper, did you think for an instant that any one blamed you?" She leaned over and set some kisses, not disturbing Joel that some of them fell on his stubby nose. "No, no," said Joel, through the raindrops down his cheeks, "but it was Phronsie, Polly." It was no use to try to check him yet, for the boy's heart was almost broken, and so Polly let him cry on. But she bestowed little reassuring pats on his shaking shoulders, all the while saying the most comforting things she could think of. "And just think, Joey," she cried suddenly, "you were the one who found Dr. Pennell. Oh, I should think you'd be so glad." "I am glad," said Joel, beginning to feel a ray of comfort. "And how quickly you brought him, Joe," said Polly, delighted at the effect of her last remark. "Did I?" said Joel, in a surprised way, and roused out of his crying. "I thought it was ever so long, Polly." "I don't see how you ever did it, Joel, in all this world," declared Polly positively.
Joel didn't say that it was because he was a sprinter at school; he found himself equal to the job. Nor did he think it of enough importance to mention how many people he had run into, leaving a great amount of vexation in his rear as he sped on. He was just going out of his door, he announced simply. "Oh, Joey!" gasped Polly. Then she hugged him rapturously. "But you caught him!" "Yes, I caught him, and we jumped into his carriage, and that's all." "But it was something to be always proud of," cried Polly in a transport. Joel, feeling very glad that there was something to be proud of at all in this evening's transactions, sat up quite straight at this, and wiped his eyes. "Now that's a good boy," said Polly encouragingly. "Mamsie will be very glad," and she ran over to get a towel, dip it in the water basin, and bring it back. "Oh, that feels so good," said Joel, with a wintry smile, as she stopped his red eyelids and poor swollen nose. "So it must," said Polly pitifully, "and I am going to bring the basin here, and do it some more." Which she did, so that by that time Phronsie was brought downstairs to sleep in Mrs. Fisher's room, Joel was quite presentable. "Here they come," announced Polly radiantly, hearing the noise on the stairs, and running back to set the basin and towel in their places. "Now, Joey, you can see for yourself that Phronsie is all right." And there she was, perched on Dr. Pennell's shoulder, to be sure, and Mamsie hurrying in to her boy, and everything was just as beautiful as it could be. "See, Joel, I'm all fixed up nice," laughed Phronsie from her perch. Joel's mouth worked dreadfully, but he saw Mamsie's eyes, so he piped up bravely, "I'm so glad, Phronsie." It sounded very funnily, for it died away in his throat, and he couldn't have said another word possibly, but Phronsie was sleepy, and didn't notice. And then the doctor said they must go out, so with a last glance at Phronsie, to be sure that she was all right, Joel went off, Polly holding his hand. The next evening they were all drawn up before the library fire, Polly on the big rug with Joel's head in her lap, his eyes fixed on Phronsie, who was ensconced in an easy chair, close to which Grandpapa was sitting. "Tell stories, do, Polly," begged Van. "Yes, do, Polly," said little Dick, who had spent most of the day in trying to get near to Phronsie, keeping other people very much occupied in driving him off, as she had to be very quiet. "Do, Polly," he begged. "Oh, Polly's tired," said Jasper, knowing that she had been with Phronsie all her spare time, and looking at the brown eyes which were drooping a bit in the firelight. "Oh, no, I will," said Polly, rousing herself, and feeling that she ought not to be tired, when Phronsie was getting well so fast, and everything was so beautiful. "I'll tell you one. Let me see, what shall it be about?" And she leant her head into her hands to think a bit. "Let her off," said Jasper. "Do, boys, I'll tell you one instead," he said. "No, we don't want yours," said Van, not very politely. "We want Polly's." "For shame, Van," said Percy, who dearly loved to reprove his brother, and never allowed the occasion to slip, when he could do so. "For shame yourself," retorted Van, flinging himself down on the rug. You're everlastingly teasing Polly to do things when she's tired to death. So there, Percy Whitney!"
"Oh, I'll tell the story," Polly said, hastily bringing her brown head up, while Phronsie began to look troubled. "I'd like to tell a story," said Tom Beresford slowly, where he sat just back of the big rug. All the young folks turned to regard him, and Van was just going to say, "Oh, we don't want yours, Tom," when Polly leaned forward. "Oh, will you, Tom?" so eagerly that Van hadn't the heart to object. "Yes, I will," promised Tom, nodding at her. "Well, get down on the rug, then," said Jasper, moving up. "The storyteller always has to have a place of honor here." "That's so?" cried Tom. "Well, here goes," and he precipitated himself at once into the midst of things. "Ow, get out!" cried Van crossly, and giving him a push. "Oh, Vanny," said Polly reprovingly. "Well, he's so big and long," grumbled Van, who didn't fancy anybody coming between him and Polly. "I might cut off a piece of my legs," said Tom, "to oblige you, I suppose. They are rather lengthy, and that's a fact," regarding them as they stretched out in the firelight. "I'll curl 'em up in a twist like a Turk," which he did. "Well, now," said Jasper, "we're ready. So fire ahead, Beresford." Joel, who all this time had been regarding his friend curiously, having never heard him tell a story at Dr. Marks' school, couldn't keep his eyes from him, but regarded him with a fixed stare, which Tom was careful to avoid by looking steadily into the fire. "Well, now, I'm not fine at expressing myself," he began. "I should think not," put in Joel, uncomplimentarily. "Joel, you beggar, hush up!" said Jasper, with a warning pinch. "Yes, just sit on that individual, will you, Jasper?" said Tom over his shoulder, "or I never will even begin." So Jasper, promising to quench all further disturbance on Joel's part, the story was taken up. "I can only tell a plain, unvarnished tale," said Tom, "but it's one that ought to be told, and in this very spot. Perhaps you don't any of you know that in Dr. Marks' school it's awfully hard to be good." "Is it any harder than in any other school, Tom?" asked Mrs. Fisher quietly. Tom turned to reply. "I don't know, Mrs. Fisher, because I haven't been at any other school. But I can't imagine a place where everything is made so hard for a boy. To begin with, there is old Fox." "Oh, Tom!" exclaimed Phronsie, leaning forward, whereat old Mr. King laid a warning hand upon the well arm. "There, there, Phronsie, sit back, child," so she obeyed. "But, Grandpapa, he said there was an old fox at Joey's school," she declared, dreadfully excited, and lifting her face to his. "Well, and so she is, Phronsie," declared Tom, whirling his long body suddenly around, and thereby receiving a dig in the back from Van, who considered him intruding on his space. "A fox by name and a fox by nature, but we'll call her, for convenience, a person." "She's the matron," said Percy, feeling called upon to explain. "Oh!" said Phronsie, drawing a long breath. "But I thought Tom said she was a fox, Grandpapa." "That's her name," said Tom, nodding at her. "Jemima Fox, isn't that a sweet name, Phronsie?" "I don't think it is a very sweet one, Tom," said Phronsie, feeling quite badly to be obliged to say so. "I agree with you," said Tom, while all the others laughed. "Well, Phronsie, she's just as far from being nice as her name is." "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Phronsie, looking quite grieved. "But I have something nice to tell you," said Tom quickly, "so I'll hurry on and let the other personages at Dr. Marks' slide. Well, but I want you all to understand, though," and he wrinkled up his brows, "that when a fellow does real bang up fine things at school, it means something. You will, won't you?" He included them all now in a sweeping glance, letting his blue eyes rest the longest on Mrs. Fisher's face, while Phronsie broke in, "What's bang up, Grandpapa?" "You must ask Tom," replied Grandpapa with a little laugh. "Oh, that's just schoolboy lingo," Tom made haste to say, as his face got red. "What's lingo?" asked Phronsie, more puzzled than before. That's oh dear!" Tom's face rivaled the firelight by this time for color. "Phronsie, I wouldn't ask any more questions now," said Polly gently. "Boys say so many things that it isn't necessary to know now. Let's listen to the story." "I will," said Phronsie, feeling quite relieved that it wasn't really incumbent on her to ask for explanations. So she sat back quietly in her big chair, while Tom shot Polly a grateful look.
"Well, there are lots of chaps at our school," went on Tom. "I suppose there are at all schools, but at any rate we have them in big quantity, who are mad when they see the other boys get on."
"Oh, Tom!" exclaimed Polly.
"Yes, they are, mad clear through," declared Tom positively. "And it's principally in athletics." Phronsie made a little movement at this word, but remembering that she was not to ask questions, for Polly had said so, she became quiet again. "They simply can't bear that a boy gets ahead of 'em. It just knocks 'em all up." Tom was rushing on, with head thrown back and gazing into the fire. "Tom," said Joel, bounding up suddenly to take his head out of Polly's lap, and to sit quite straight, "I wouldn't run on like this if I were you." "You hush up, Pepper," said Tom coolly. "I haven't said a word about you. I shall say what I like. I tell you, it just does knock 'em all up. I know, for I've been that way myself." This was getting on such dangerous ground that Joel opened his mouth to remonstrate, but Polly put her hand over it. "I'd let Tom tell his story just as he wants to," which had the effect of smothering Joel's speech for the time being. "I thought, Jasper, you were going to quench Joe," observed Tom, who seemed to have the power to see out of the back of his head, and was now conscious of the disturbance. "You don't seem to be much good." "Oh, Polly's doing it this time," said Jasper. "I'll take him in tow the next offense." "Yes, I have," declared Tom. "Been that way myself. I'm going to tell you how, and then I'll feel better about it." His ruddy face turned quite pale now, and his eyes shone. "Stop him!" howled Joel, all restraint thrown to the winds and shaking off Polly's fingers. Jasper leaned forward. "I'm bound to make you keep the peace, Joe," he said, shaking his arm. "But he's going to tell about things he ought not to," cried Joel in an agony. "Do stop him, Jasper." Mother Fisher leaned forward and fastened her black eyes on Joel's face. "I think Tom better go on, Joel," she said. "I want to hear it." That settled the matter, and Joel threw himself down, his face buried in Polly's lap, while he stuck his fingers in his ears. "I'm going to tell you all this story," Tom was saying, "because I ought to. You won't like me very well after it, but it's got to come out. Well, I might as well mention names now, since Joe has got to keep still. You can't guess how he's been tormented by some of those cads, simply because he's our best tennis player, and on the football team. They've made things hum for him." Tom threw back his head and clenched his fist where it lay in his lap. "And the rest of us boys got mad, especially at one of them. He was the ringleader, and the biggest cad and bully of them all." No one said a word. "I hate to mention names, it seems awfully mean." Tom's face got fiery red again. "And yet, as you all know, why, it can't be helped. Jenkins, well, there, a fellow would want to be excused from speaking to him. And yet," down fell Tom's head shamefacedly, "I let him show me how he was going to play a dastardly trick on Joe the very day of the tennis tournament. I did, that's a fact." No one spoke, but Tom could feel what might have been said had the thoughts all been expressed, and he burst out desperately, "I let that cad take Joe's racket." A general rustle, as if some speech were coming, made him forestall it by plunging on. "His beautiful racket he'd been practising with for this tournament, and I not only didn't knock the scoundrel down, but I helped the thing along. I wouldn't have supposed I could do it. Joe was to play with Ricketson against Green and me, and 2 minutes after it was done, I'd have given everything to have had it back on Joe's table, but the boys were pouring up, and it was hidden." Tom could get no further, but hung his head for the reaction sure to set in against him by all this household that had welcomed and entertained him so handsomely. "Has he got through? Has the beggar finished?" cried Joel lustily. "Yes," said Polly in a low voice. "I think he has, Joel." "Then I want to say," Joel threw himself over by Tom, his arms around him, "that he's the biggest fraud to spring such a trap on me, and plan to get off that yarn here." "I didn't intend to when I came," said Tom, thinking it necessary to tell the whole truth. "I hadn't the courage." "Pity you had, now," retorted Joel. "Oh, you beggar!" He laid his round cheek against Tom's. "Mamsie, Grandpapa, Polly," his black eyes sweeping the circle, "if I were to tell you all this chap has done for me, why, he took me to the place where Jenk hid the racket." "Pshaw, that was nothing," said Tom curtly. "Nothing? Well, I got it in time for the tournament. You saw to that. And when Jenk and I were having it out in the pine grove that night, Tom thought he'd better tell Dave, though I can't say I thank you for that," brought up Joel regretfully, "for I was getting the best of Jenk." Old Mr. King had held himself well in check up to this point. "How did you know, Tom, my boy, that Joel and this Jenk," furnished Joel. "Yes, Jenk, were going to settle it that night?"
"Why, you see, sir," Tom, in memory of the excitement and pride over Joel's prowess, so far recovered himself as to turn to answer, "Joel couldn't very well finish it there, for the dormitory got too hot for that sort of thing, although it would have been rare good sport for all the fellows to have seen Jenk flat, for he was always beating other chaps, I mean little ones, not half his size."
"Oh, dear me!" breathed Polly indignantly.
"Yes, well, Joe promised Jenk he would finish it some other time, and Jenk dared him and taunted him after the tournament. He was wild with rage because Joel won, and he lost his head, or he would have let Joe alone."
"I see," exclaimed Grandpapa, his eyes shining.
"Well, and so you sat up and watched the affair?"
"I couldn't go to bed, you know," said Tom simply.
"And he would have saved us, Dave and me, if that Jenk hadn't locked the door on us when he slipped in."
"Cad!" exclaimed Tom between his teeth.
"He ought to have been expelled for that. And then Joe shinnied up the conductor, and you know the rest."
Mother Fisher shivered and leaned over involuntarily toward her boy.
"Mamsie!" exclaimed Joel, "you don't know what Tom is to me in that school. He's just royal, that's what he is," with a resounding slap on his back.
"And I say so too," declared Mother Fisher, with shining eyes.
"What?" roared Tom, whirling around so suddenly that Van this time got out of the way, only by rolling entirely off from the rug. "Mrs. Fisher, you can't, after I've told you this, although I'm no end sorry about the racket. I didn't want to tell, fought against it, but I had to."
"I stand by what I've said, Tom," said Mrs. Fisher, putting out her hand, when Tom immediately laid his big brown one within it. At this Joel howled with delight, which he was unable to express enough to meet his wishes, so he plunged off to the middle of the library floor, and turned a brace of somersaults, coming up red and shining.
"I feel better now," he said. "That's the way I used to do in the little brown house when I liked things."
End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Five Little Peppers at School by Margaret Sidney. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19 The Grand Entertainment.
"Ought we to, Mamsie?" asked Polly.
Jasper and she were in Mrs. Fisher's room, and they both waited for the reply anxiously. "Yes, Polly, I think you ought," said Mother Fisher.
"Oh dear me, Phronsie can't have only a little bit of it," said Polly.
"I know it, but think, Polly, the boys have to go back to school so soon that even if other people didn't care if it were postponed, they would lose it. Besides, Tom is to be one of the chief people on the program. No, no, Polly, there are others to think of outside of ourselves. You must have your entertainment just as it is planned," Mrs. Fisher brought out very decidedly.
"Well," sighed Polly, "I'm glad that Papa Fisher says that Phronsie can hear a little part of it, anyway."
"Yes," said her mother cheerfully, "and Helen Fargo is to sit next to her. Mrs. Fargo is to take her home early, as she has not been very well. So you see, Polly, it will all turn out very good after all."
"But I did so want Phronsie to be there through the whole," mourned Polly.
"So did I," echoed Jasper. Then he caught Mother Fisher's eye. "But, Polly, the boys would lose it then," he added quickly.
"Oh!" cried Polly, "so they would. I keep forgetting that. Dear me, why isn't everything just right, so that they could all hear it?" And she gave a little flounce.
"Everything is just right, Polly," said Mrs. Fisher gravely. "Don't let me hear you complain of things that no one can help."
"I didn't mean to complain, Mamsie," said Polly humbly,
and she crept up to her, while Jasper looked very much distressed. "Mother knows you didn't," said Mrs. Fisher, putting her arm around her. "But it's a bad habit, Polly, to be impatient when things don't go rightly. Now run away, both of you," she finished brightly, "and work up your program," and she set a kiss on Polly's rosy cheek.
"Jasper!" cried Polly, with happiness once more in her heart as they raced off. "I tell you what we can do. We must change the program, and put those things that Phronsie likes up first." "That's so!" cried Jasper, well pleased. "Now what will they be, Polly?" "Why, Mr. Dyce's story of the dog," said Polly, "for one thing. Phronsie thinks that's perfectly lovely, and always asks him for it when he tells her stories." "All right," said Jasper. "What next?" Why, Tom must sing one of his funny songs." "Yes, of course, that will please her ever so much," cried Jasper. "Don't you know how she claps her hands when he's rehearsing, Polly?" "Yes. Oh, I wouldn't have her miss that for anything, Jasper," said Polly. "No, indeed," cried Jasper heartily. "Well, Polly, then what ought to come next? Let's come into the den and fix it up now." So they ran into the den, and Jasper got out the long program all ready to be pinned up beside the improvised stage on the evening of the great event, and spread it on the table, Polly meanwhile clearing off the books. "Let's see." He wrinkled up his brow, running his finger down the whole length. "Now, when I make the new program, Mr. Dyce goes first." Polly stood quite still at that. "Oh, Jasper, we can't do it! No, never in all this world!" "Why, Polly," he turned suddenly, "yes, we can, just as easily. See, Polly." "We can't spoil that lovely program that you took so long to make, for anything," said Polly, in a decisive fashion. "Phronsie wouldn't want it," she added. "Phronsie isn't to know anything about it," said Jasper, just as decidedly. "Well, but Jasper, you can't make another; you haven't the time," said Polly, in great distress, and wishing she hadn't said anything about the changes. "I didn't think there would have to be a new program made." "Oh, Polly, I think we'd better have a new one," said Jasper, who was very particular about everything. "I thought we were going to have changes announced from the stage," said Polly. "Oh, why can't we, Jasper? I'm sure they do that very often." "Well, that's when the changes come at the last moment," said Jasper, reluctantly. "Well, I'm sure this is the last moment," said Polly. "The entertainment is to-morrow night, and we've ever so much to do yet. Please, Jasper." That "please, Jasper" won the day. "All right, Polly," he said. "Well, now, let's see what ought to come after Tom's song." "Well, Phronsie is very anxious to hear Pickering's piece, I know, because I heard her tell Mamsie so." "Why, she has heard Pick recite that ever so many times since he learned it from our school exhibition," said Jasper. "And don't you know that's just the very reason why she wants it again?" said Polly, with a little laugh. "Yes, of course," said Jasper, laughing too. "Well, she must have it then. So down goes Pick." He ran to the table drawer and drew out a big sheet of paper. "First Mr. Dyce, then Tom Beresford, then Pickering Dodge," writing fast. "And then," said Polly, running up to look over his shoulder, "Phronsie wants dreadfully to hear Tom play on his banjo." "Oh, Polly!" Jasper threw back his head to look at her. "I don't believe there'll be time for all that. You know the music by Miss Taylor comes first as an overture. We can't change that." "Why," exclaimed Polly in dismay, "we must, Jasper, get Tom's banjo in, and there's Percy's piece. Phronsie wouldn't miss that for anything." "Why, we shall have the whole program if we keep on," said Jasper, looking at her in dismay. "Oh, Jasper, Papa Fisher says that Phronsie may stay in 20 minutes. Just think, we can do a lot in 20 minutes." "But somebody's bound to be late, so we can't begin on time. Nobody ever does, Polly." "We must," said Polly passionately. "Begin on time to-morrow night, Jasper." "We'll try," said Jasper, as cheerfully as he could manage. "And there's your piece. Why, Jasper, Phronsie told me herself that she must hear yours." "Well, and so she told me that she'd rather hear you play your piece," said Jasper. "But you and I, Polly, as long as we change the program, can't come in among the first." "No, of course not," said Polly. "But oh, Jasper," and she gave a sigh, "it's too bad that you can't recite yours, for it is most beautiful." Polly clasped her hands, and sighed again. "Well, that's not to be thought of," said Jasper. "Now I tell you how we'll fix it, Polly," he said quickly. "How?" asked Polly gloomily. "Why, we have 20 minutes that Phronsie can stay in. Now let's mark off all those things she wants, except yours and mine, even if they come beyond that time, and then we'll just draw those that will get into the 20 minutes." "Oh, Jasper, what a fine idea!" exclaimed Polly, all her enthusiasm returning. "We'll mark off half of them, and I'll write the others," said Jasper, tearing off strips from his big sheet of paper. So Polly and he fell to work, and presently Pick and Tom, that's for the song, said Polly, and Banjo, and Mr. Dyce, and Percy went down on the little strips. "Oh, and I forgot," said Polly, raising her head away from her last strip. "Phronsie wanted to hear Clare very much indeed." "Well, we should have had the whole program with a vengeance," said Jasper, bursting into a laugh. "Well, put him down, Polly."
So Claire went down on another strip, and then they were all jumbled up in a little Chinese bowl on the bookcase. "Now you draw first, Polly," said Jasper. "Oh, no, let us choose for first draw," said Polly. "That's the way to be absolutely right." So she ran back to the table and tore off two more strips, one short and the other long, and fixed them in between her hands. "You didn't see?" she asked over her shoulder. "Not a wink," said Jasper, laughing. So Polly ran back, and Jasper drew the short one. "There you have it, Polly," he cried gleefully. "Oh, that's good." "Oh, I do hope I shall draw the right one, Jasper," she said, standing on tiptoe, her fingers trembling over the bowl. "They are all of them good," said Jasper encouragingly. So Polly suddenly picked out one, and together they read, "Tom." "Fine!" they shouted. "Oh, isn't that perfectly splendid!" cried Polly, "because you see Phronsie did so very much wish to hear Tom sing," just as if she hadn't mentioned that fact before. "Now, Jasper." "I'm in much the same predicament as you were," said Jasper, pausing, his hand over the bowl. "If I shouldn't choose the right one, Polly." "They are all of them good," said Polly, laughing at his face. "Oh, I know, but it is a fearful responsibility," said Jasper, wrinkling his brows worse yet. "Well, here goes." He plunged his fingers in, and out they came with the strip, Percy. "Now, Jasper, you couldn't possibly have chosen better," declared Polly, hopping up and down, "for Phronsie did so want to hear Percy speak, and it will please Percy so. Oh, I'm so glad." "Well, I'm thankful I haven't to draw again," declared Jasper, "for we can't have but 3 pieces beside the overture, you know. So it's your turn now, Polly." "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Polly, the color dying down in her cheek. "If I shouldn't draw the right one, Jasper King, and it's the last chance!" She stood so long with her hand poised over the Chinese bowl that Jasper finally laughed out. "Oh, Polly, aren't your tiptoes tired?" "Not half so tired as I am," said Polly grimly. "Jasper, I'm going to run across the room, and then run back and draw suddenly without stopping to think." "Do!" cried Jasper. So Polly ran into the further corner, and came flying up to get on her tiptoes, thrust in her fingers, and bring out the third and last strip. "The deed is done!" exclaimed Jasper. "Now, Polly, let's see who it is." "Pick!" he shouted, and "Pickering!" screamed Polly. And they took hold of hands and spun round and round the den. "Oh, dear, we're knocking off your beautiful program!" cried Polly, pausing in dismay. "It hasn't hurt it any, our mad whirl hasn't," said Jasper, picking up the long program where it had slipped off the table to the floor. "Polly, you can't think how I wanted Pick to be chosen. It will do him so much good." "And only think if I hadn't chosen him out of that bowl," cried Polly, in dismay at the very thought. "Well, you did, Polly, so it's all right," said Jasper. "Now everything is fixed, and it's going to be the finest affair that ever was," he added enthusiastically. "And the best of it is, I can't help it, Polly, that Mrs. Chatterton isn't to come back till next week," he brought up in great satisfaction. Mrs. Chatterton had gone to New York for some weeks, but was to return to finish her visit at Cousin Horatio's. "And I am so glad too," confessed Polly, but feeling as if she oughtn't to say it. "And isn't everything just beautiful, Jasper?" "I should think it was," cried Jasper jubilantly. "Just as perfect as it can be, Polly." And the next afternoon, when the last preparations for the grand entertainment were made, and everybody was rushing off to dress for dinner, a carriage drove up the winding driveway. There were big trunks on the rack, and 2 people inside. Joel, racing along the hall with Tom at his heels, took one look. "Oh, whickets!" he ejaculated, stopping short, to bring his feet down with a thud. "What's the row?" asked Tom, plunging up to him in amazement. "The person!" Joel pointed a finger at the carriage. "I must tell Polly," and off he darted. Tom, not feeling at all sure that he ought to wait to see "that person," wheeled about and followed. "Polly!" roared Joel, long before he got to her. "She's come!" "Has she?" Polly called back, supposing he meant Alexia. "Well, tell her to come up here, Joe, in my room." Joel took the stairs 2 at a time, Tom waiting below, and dashed into the blue and white room without ceremony. "Polly, you don't understand," he blurted out. "She's come!" Polly had her head bent over a drawer, picking out some ribbons. At the sound of Joel's voice, she drew it out and looked at him. "Why, how funny you look, Joe," she said. "What's the matter?" "I guess you'd look funny," said Joel glumly, "if you'd seen Mrs. Chatterton." "Not Mrs. Chatterton!" exclaimed Polly, aghast, and jumping up, her face very pale, and upsetting her box of ribbons, she seized Joel's arm. "Tell me this very minute, Joel Pepper," she commanded. "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Chatterton has just come. I saw her coming up the drive. There's Johnson now letting her in." Joel had it all out now in a burst, ready to cry at sight of Polly's face, as the bustle in the hall below and the thin, high voice proclaimed the worst. "Oh, Joel, Joel!" mourned Polly, releasing his arm to wring her hands. "What shall we do?" "She's an old harpy," declared Joel. "Mean, horrid old thing." "Oh, stop, Joel!" cried Polly, quite horrified. "Well, she is," said Joel vindictively, "to come before we'd got back to school." "Well, don't say so," begged Polly, having hard work to keep back her own words, crowding for utterance. "Mamsie wouldn't like it, Joey." Joel, with this thought on his mind, only grumbled out something so faintly that really Polly couldn't hear, as she ran out into the hall. "Oh, Jasper!" "Polly, did you know? What can we do?" It was impossible for him to conceal his vexation, and Polly lost sight of her own discomfiture in the attempt to comfort him. "And, Father, it will just make him as miserable as he can be," said Jasper gloomily. "And he was so happy over the beautiful time we were going to have this evening." He was so vexed he could do nothing but prance up and down the hall. "Well, we must make him forget that she is here," said Polly, swallowing her own distress at the change of all the conditions. "How can we, Polly?" Jasper stopped for a minute and stared at her. "I mean," said Polly, feeling that it was a very hopeless case after all, "that we mustn't show that we mind it, her coming back, and must act as if we forgot it. And then that will keep him happy, perhaps." "If you only will, Polly," cried Jasper, seizing both of her hands, "it will be the best piece of work you ever did." "Oh, I can't do it alone!" exclaimed Polly in consternation. "Never in all this world, Jasper, unless you help too." "Then we'll both do our very best," said Jasper. "I'm sure I ought to. 'Twould be mean enough to expect you to go at such a task alone." "Oh, you couldn't be mean, Jasper," declared Polly, in horror at the very thought. "Well, I should be if I left you to tackle this by yourself," said Jasper with a grim little laugh. "So, Polly, there's my hand on it. I'll help you." And Polly ran back to pick up her ribbons and dress for dinner, feeling somehow very happy after all, that there was something she could do for dear Grandpapa to help him bear this great calamity. Tom Beresford, meanwhile, withdrew from the great hall when Johnson ushered in the tall, stately woman and her French maid, and took shelter in the library. And Mrs. Whitney, coming over the stairs, saying, "Well, Cousin Eunice, did you have a pleasant journey?" in the gentle voice Tom so loved, gave him the first inkling of the relationship. But he wrinkled his brows at Joel's exclamation, and his queer way of rushing off. "You know journeys always tire me, Marian, so that your question is quite useless. I will sit in the library a moment to recover myself. Hortense, go up and prepare my room." And she sailed into the apartment, her heavy silk gown swishing close to Tom's chair. "Who is that boy?" she demanded sharply. Then she put up her lorgnette, and examined him closely as if of a new and probably dangerous species. Tom slipped off from his chair and stiffened up. "It's one of Joel's friends," said Mrs. Whitney, slipping her hand within the tall boy's arm. "The boys are at home from school for a week." "Joel's friends," repeated Mrs. Chatterton, paying scant attention to the rest of the information. Then she gave a scornful cackle. "Haven't you got over that nonsense yet, Marian?" she asked. "No, and I trust I never shall," replied Mrs. Whitney with a happy smile. "Now, Cousin Eunice, as you wish to rest, we will go," and she drew Tom off. "My boy," she said, releasing him in the hall, to give a bright glance up at the stormy, astonished face above her, "I know you and Joel will get dressed as rapidly as possible for dinner, for my father will not want to be annoyed by a lack of promptness to-night." She did not say, because he will have annoyance enough, but Tom guessed it all. "I will, Mrs. Whitney," he promised heartily, and thinking he would go to the ends of the earth for her, to be smiled on like that, he plunged off over the stairs. "I've seen the old cat!" he cried in a smothered wrath to Joel, rushing into his room. Joel sat disconsolately on the edge of his bed, kicking off his heavy shoes to replace with his evening ones. "Have you?" said Joel grimly. "Well, isn't she at—" Then he remembered Mamsie and snapped his lips too. "Ah!" exclaimed Tom in smothered wrath as he closed the door. "She isn't at all, Joe. She's the." "Well, do be still," cried Joel, putting on his best shoes nervously, "or you'll have me saying something. And she's visiting here, and Momsey wouldn't like it. Don't, Tom," he begged. "I won't," said Tom with a monstrous effort, "but oh dear me!" Then he rushed into his own room and banged about, getting his best clothes out. "Shut the door!" roared Joel after him, "or you'll begin to fume, and I can't stand it, Tom. It will set me off." So Tom shut the door, and with all these precautions going on over the house, all the family in due time appeared at dinner, prepared as best they could to bear the infliction of Mrs. Chatterton's return. And after the conclusion of the meal, why, everybody tried to forget it as much as possible, and give themselves up to the grand affair of the evening. And old Mr. King, who had been consumed with fear that it would have a disastrous effect on Polly and Jasper, the chief getters up of the entertainment, came out of his fright nicely, for there they were, as bright and jolly as ever, and fully equal to any demands upon them. So he made up his mind that, after all, he could put up with Cousin Eunice a bit longer, and that the affair was to be an immense success, and the very finest thing possible. And everybody else who was present on the eventful occasion said so too. And it seemed as if Mr. King's spacious drawing-room, famous for its capacity at all such times, couldn't possibly have admitted another person to this entertainment for the benefit of the poor brakeman's family. And Joel, who wasn't good at recitations, and who detested all that sort of thing, and Van, for the same reason, were both in their element at ticket-takers, and the little pink and yellow squares came in so thick and fast that both boys had all they could do for a while, which was saying a good deal, to collect them. And everybody said that Miss Mary Taylor had never played such a beautiful overture, and she was capable of a good deal along that line, in all her life, and Phronsie, sitting well to the front, between old Mr. King and Helen Fargo, forgot that she had ever had a hurt arm and that it lay bandaged up in her lap. And little Dick, when he could lose sight of the fact that he wasn't next to Phronsie instead of Helen Fargo, snuggled up contentedly against Mother Fisher, and applauded everything straight through. And old Mr. King protested that he was perfectly satisfied with the whole thing, which was saying the most that could be expressed for the quality of the entertainment, and he took particular pains to applaud Tom Beresford, who looked very handsome and acquitted himself well. "I must," said Tom to himself, although quaking inwardly, "for they've all been so good to me, and for Joel's sake." So he sang at his very best, and he played his banjo merrily, and he was encored and encored, and Joel was as proud as could be, which did Tom good to see. And Percy, well, the tears of joy came into his mother's eyes, for it wasn't easy for him to learn pieces, nor in fact to apply himself to study at all. But no one would have suspected it to see him now on that stage. And Grandpapa King was so overjoyed that he called, "Bravo! Bravo!" ever so many times, which carried Percy on triumphantly over the difficult spots where he had been afraid he should slip. "If only his father could hear him," sighed Mrs. Whitney in the midst of her joy, longing, as she always did, for the time when the father could finish those trips over the sea, for his business house. Polly had made Jasper consent, which he did reluctantly, to give his recitation before she played, insisting that music was really better for a finale. And she listened with such delight for the applause that he received, for ever so many of the audience said it was the gem of the whole, that she quite forgot to be nervous about her whole performance, and she played her nocturne with such a happy heart, thinking over the lovely evening, and how the money would be, oh, such a heap to take down on the morrow to the poor brakeman's home, that Jasper was turning the last page of her music, and the entertainment was at an end. Polly hopped off from the music stool. There was a great clapping all over the room, and Grandpapa called out, "Yes, child, play again!" So there was nothing for Polly to do but hop back again, and give them another selection. And then they clapped harder yet, but Polly shook her brown head, and rushed off the stage. And then, of course, Grandpapa gave them, as he always did, a fine party to wind up the evening with. And the camp chairs were folded up and carried off, and a company of musicians came into the alcove, in the spacious hall, and all through the beautiful large apartments festivity reigned. "Look at the old cat," said Tom in a smothered aside to Joel, his next neighbor in the Sir Roger de Coverley. "Isn't she a sight?" "I don't want to," said Joel with a grimace, "and it's awfully mean in you, Tom, to ask me." "I know it," said Tom petulantly, "but I can't keep my eyes off from her. How your grandfather can stand it, Pepper, I don't see." And a good many other people were asking themselves the same question, Madam Dyce among the number, to whom Mrs. Chatterton was just remarking, "Cousin Horatio is certainly not the same man." "No," replied Madam Dyce distinctly. "He is infinitely improved, so approachable now." "You mistake me," Mrs. Chatterton said angrily. "I mean, there is the greatest change come over him. It's lamentable, and all brought about by his inexplicable infatuation over those low-born Pepper children and their designing mother." "Mrs. Chatterton," said Madam Dyce. She could be quite as stately as Mr. King's cousin, and she felt in secure possession of all the right in the case. She was vastly more impressive. "I am not here to go over this question, nor shall I discuss it anywhere with you. You know my mind about it. I only wish I had the Peppers, yes, every single one of them," warmed up the old lady, "in my house, and that fine woman, their mother, along with them." Chapter 20. Of Five Little Peppers at School by Margaret Sidney. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. The Corcoran Family. And on the morrow, oh, what a heap of money there was for the poor brakeman's family! $412! For a good many people had fairly insisted on paying twice the amount for their tickets, and a good many more had paid when they couldn't take tickets at all, going out of town, or for some other good reason. And one old lady, a great friend of the family, sent for Polly Pepper the week before, and when Polly appeared before the big lounge, for Mrs. Sterling was lifted from her bed to lie under the sofa blankets all day, she said, "Now, my dear, I want to take some tickets for that affair of yours. Gibbons, get my check book." So Gibbons, the maid, brought the check book, and drew up the little stand, with the writing case upon it close to the lounge, and Mrs. Sterling did a bit of writing, and presently she held out a long green slip of paper. "Oh!" cried Polly in huge delight, "I've never had one for my very own self before." There it was, Polly Pepper, running clear across its face, and oh! with wide eyes, when she saw the amount, $25! "Haven't you so?" said Mrs. Sterling, greatly pleased to be the first in one of Polly's pleasures. "Oh!" cried Polly again, $25! And she threw herself down before the lounge, and dropped a kiss upon the hand that had made all the happiness for the brakeman's poor children. "Well, now, Polly, tell me about it," said Mrs. Sterling, with a glow at her heart warm enough to brighten many a long invalid day. "Gibbons, get a cricket for Miss Mary." "Oh, may I sit here?" begged Polly eagerly, as Gibbons, placing the little writing case back into its position, now approached with the cricket. "It's so cosy on the floor." "Why, yes, if you don't wish the cricket," said Mrs. Sterling with a little laugh, "and I remember when I was your age it was my greatest delight to sit on the floor." "It is mine," said Polly, snuggling up to the sofa blankets. Mrs. Sterling put out her thin hand and took Polly's rosy palm. "Now begin, dear," she said, with an air of content, and looking down into the bright face. So Polly, realizing that here perhaps was need for help, quite as much as in the poor brakeman's home, though in a different way, told the whole story, how the two clubs, the Salisbury School Club and the Boys' Club, had joined together to help Jim Corcoran's children, how they had had a big meeting at Jasper's house, and promised each other to take hold faithfully and work for that object. "We were going to have a little play," observed Polly a bit sorrowfully, "but it was thought best not, so it will be recitations and music." "Those will be very nice, I'm quite sure, Polly," said Mrs. Sterling. "How I should love to hear some of them." It was her turn to look sad now. "Why," Polly sat up quite straight now, and her cheeks turned rosy. "What is it, my child?" asked Mrs. Sterling. Do you want Oh, Mrs. Sterling, would you like us to come here some time to recite something to you?" Mrs. Sterling turned an eager face on her pillow. "Are you sure, Polly?" a light coming into her tired eyes, "that you young people would be willing to come to entertain a dull, sick old woman?" "Oh, I'm sure they would," cried Polly, "if you would like it, dear Miss Sterling." "Like it?" Mrs. Sterling turned her thin face to the wall for a moment. When she looked again at Polly, there were tears trickling down the wasted cheeks. "Polly, you don't know," she said brokenly, "how I just long to hear young voices here in this dreary old house. To lie here day after day, child." "Oh!" cried Polly suddenly, "it must be so very dreadful, Mrs. Sterling." "Well, don't let's speak of that," said Mrs. Sterling, breaking off quickly her train of thought. "For the worst isn't the pain and the weakness, Polly, it's the loneliness, child." "Oh!" said Polly; then it all rushed over her, how she might have run in before, and taken the other girls, if she had only known. "But we will come now, dear Miss Sterling," she said aloud. "Do!" cried Mrs. Sterling, and a faint color began to show itself on her thin face. "But not unless you are quite sure that the young people will like it, Polly." "Yes, I'm sure," said Polly, with a decided nod of her brown head. "Then why couldn't you hold some of your rehearsals here?" proposed Mrs. Sterling. "Shouldn't we tire you?" asked Polly. "No, indeed!" declared Mrs. Sterling, with sudden energy. "I could bear a menagerie up here, Polly," and she laughed outright. Gibbons, at this unwonted sound, popped her head in from the adjoining room, where she was busy with her sewing, to gaze in astonishment at her mistress. "I am not surprised at your face, Gibbons," said Mrs. Sterling cheerily, "for you have not heard me laugh for many a day." "No, madam, I haven't," said Gibbons, "but I can't help saying I'm rejoiced to hear it now," with a glance of approval on Polly Pepper. "So, Polly, you see there is no danger of your bringing me any fatigue, and I should be only too happy to see you at your next rehearsal." "We can come, I'm almost sure," said Polly, "those of us who want to rehearse at all. Some of us, you see, are quite sure of our pieces. Pickering Dodge is, for one; he spoke at his last school exhibition. But I'll tell the others. Oh, thank you for asking us, Mrs. Sterling." "Thank you for giving your time, dear, to a dull old woman," said Mrs. Sterling. "Oh, must you go?" She clung to her hand. "I suppose you ought, child." "Yes," said Polly, "I really ought to go, Mrs. Sterling. And you're not dull, one single bit, and I like you very much," she added, as simply as Phronsie would have said it. "Kiss me good bye, Polly," said Mrs. Sterling. So Polly laid her fresh young cheek against the poor tired wasted one, hopped into her jacket, and was off on happy feet. And the others said "yes," when they saw Polly's enthusiasm over the plan of holding a rehearsal at Mrs. Sterling's, and Jasper proposed, "Why couldn't we repeat the whole thing after our grand performance, for her sometime?" And before any one could quite tell how, a warm sympathy had been set in motion for the rich, lonely old lady in the big, gloomy stone mansion most of them passed daily on their way to school. Well, the grand affair was over now, and a greater success than was ever hoped for. Now came the enjoyment of presenting the money. "Grandpapa," said Polly, "we're all here." "So I perceive," looking out at the delegation in the hall. For of course all the two clubs couldn't go to the presentation, so committees were chosen to represent them. Polly, Clem, Alexia, and Silvia, for the Salisbury Club, and Jasper, Clare, Pickering, and Richard Burnett, for the Boys' Club, while old Mr. King, on his own account, had invited Joel, Percy, and Van, and of course Tom Beresford. "My, what shall we do with such a lot of boys?" exclaimed Alexia, as they all met in the hall. "You don't have to do anything at all with us, Alexia," retorted Joel, who liked her the best of any of Polly's friends, and always showed it by sparring with her on every occasion. "Only let us alone." "Which I shall proceed to do with the greatest pleasure," said Alexia. "Goodness me, Joe, as if I'd be bothered with you tagging on. You're much worse than before you went away to school." "Come, you two, stop your quarrelling," said Jasper, laughing. "A pretty example you'd make to those poor Corcoran children." "Oh, we shan't fight there," said Alexia sweetly. "We'll have quite enough to do to see all that is going on. Oh, Polly, when do you suppose we can ever start?" "Father has the bank book," announced Jasper. "I saw him put it in his pocket, Polly." Polly gave a little wriggle under her coat. "Oh, Jasper, isn't it just too splendid for anything?" she cried. "I'm going to walk with Polly," announced Clem, seizing Polly's arm. "So, Alexia Rhys, I give you fair warning this time." "Indeed you're not," declared Alexia stoutly. "Why, I always walk with Polly Pepper." "And that's just the reason why I'm going to today," said Clem, hanging to Polly's arm for dear life. "Well, I'm her dearest friend," said Alexia, taking refuge in that well-worn statement. "So there now, Clem Forsythe." "No, you're not," said Clem obstinately. "We're all her dearest friends, aren't we, Polly? Say, Polly, aren't we?" "Hush!" said Jasper. "Father's coming." "Well, I can't help it. I'm tired of hearing Alexia Rhys everlastingly say that, and pushing us all away from Polly." "Do hear them go on!" exclaimed Tom Beresford, off on the edge of the group. "Does she always have them carrying around like that?" "Yes," said Joel, "a great deal worse.
"Oh, they're a lot of giggling girls. I hate girls!" he exploded. "So do I," nodded Tom. "Let's keep clear of the whole lot, and walk by ourselves." "Indeed we will," declared Joel. "You won't catch me walking with girls when I can help it."
"Well, I wonder which of those two will get your sister Polly this time," said Tom, craning his long neck to see the contest. "Oh, Alexia, of course," said Joel carelessly. "She always gets her in the end." But Joel was wrong. Neither of the girls carried off Polly. Old Mr. King marched out of his reading room. "Come, Polly, my child, you and I will walk together," and he waited on her handsomely out, and down the walk to the car. Tom and Joel burst into a loud laugh, in which the others joined, at the crestfallen faces.
"Well, at least you didn't get her, Clem," said Alexia airily, coming out of her discomfiture. "Neither did you," said Clem happily.
"And you are horrid boys to laugh," said Alexia, looking over at the two. "But then all boys are horrid." "Thank you," said Tom with his best bow.
"Alexia Rhys, aren't you perfectly ashamed to be fighting with that new boy?" cried Clem.
"Come on, Alexia," said Jasper. "I shall have to walk with you to keep you in order," and the gay procession hurrying after old Mr. King and Polly caught up with them turning out of the big stone gateway. And then what a merry walk they had to the car, and that being nearly full, they had to wait for the next one, which luckily had only 3 passengers, and Mr. King and his party clambered on, to ride down through the poor quarters of the town to the Corcoran house.
"Oh, misery me!" exclaimed Alexia, looking out at the tumble-down tenements, and garbage heaps up to the very doors. "Where are we going?"
"Did you suppose Jim Corcoran lived in a palace?" asked Pickering lazily.
"Well, I didn't suppose anybody lived like that," said Alexia, wrinkling up her nose in scorn. "Dear me, look at all those children."
"Interesting, aren't they?" said Pickering, with a pang for the swarm of ragged, dirty little creatures, but not showing it in the least on his impassive face.
"Oh, I don't want to see it!" exclaimed Alexia, "and I'm not going to, either," turning her back on it all.
"It goes on just the same," said Pickering.
"Then I am going to look."
Alexia whirled around again, and gazed up and down the ugly thoroughfare, taking it all in.
"Ugh, how can you!" exclaimed Sylvia Horne, in disgust. "I think it's very disagreeable to even know that such people live."
"Perhaps 'twould be better to kill them off," said Tom Beresford bluntly.
"Ugh, you dreadful boy!" cried Clem Forsythe.
"Who's fighting now with the new boy?" asked Alexia sweetly, tearing off her gaze from the street.
"Well, who wouldn't?" retorted Clem. "He's saying such perfectly terrible things."
Pickering Dodge gave a short laugh. "Beresford, you're in for it now," he said. Tom shrugged his shoulders, and turned his back on them. "What did you bring him home for, Joe?" asked Alexia, leaning over to twitch Joel's arm.
"To plague you, Alexia," said Joel with a twinkle in his black eyes.
"Oh, he doesn't bother me," said Alexia serenely. "Clem is having all the trouble now. Well, we must put up with him, I suppose," she said with resignation.
"You don't need to," said Joel coolly. "You can let us alone, Alexia."
"But I don't want to let you alone," said Alexia. "That's all boys are good for, if they're in a party, to keep 'em stirred up. Goodness me, Mr. King and Polly are getting out," as the car stopped, and Grandpapa led the way down the aisle.
When they arrived at the Corcoran house, which was achieved by dodging around groups of untidy women gossiping with their neighbors, and children playing on the dirty pavements, with the occasional detour caused by a heap of old tin cans and other debris, Mr. King drew a long breath. "I don't know that I ought to have brought you young people down here. It didn't strike me so badly before." "But it's no worse for us to see it than for the people to live here, Father," said Jasper quickly. "That's very true, but faugh!" said the old gentleman, had great difficulty to contain himself. "Well, thank fortune, the Corcoran family are to move this week."
"Oh, Grandpapa!" cried Polly, hopping up and down on the broken pavement, and "Oh, Father!" from Jasper. "Polly Pepper!" exclaimed Alexia, twitching her away. "You came near to stepping on that old mass of bones and things."
Polly didn't even glance at the garbage heap by the edge of the sidewalk, nor give it a thought.
"Oh, how lovely, Alexia!" she cried, "that they won't have but a day or 2 more here."
"Well, we are going in," said Alexia, holding her tightly, "and I'm glad of it, Polly. Oh, misery me!" as they followed Mr. King into the poor little house that Jim the brakeman had called home. The little widow, thanks to Mr. King and several others interested in the welfare of the brakeman's family, had smartened up considerably, so that neither she nor her dwelling presented such a dingy, woebegone aspect as on the previous visit; and old Mr. King, being very glad to see this, still further heartened her up by exclaiming, "Well, Mrs. Corcoran, you've accomplished wonders."
"I've tried to," cried the poor woman, "and I'm sure 'twas no more than I ought to do, and you being so kind to me and mine, sir."
"Well, I've brought you some young people to see," said the old gentleman abruptly, who never could bear to be thanked, and now felt much worse, as there were several spectators of his bounty, and he waved his hand towards the representatives of the two clubs. They all huddled back, but he made them come forward. "No, it's your affair to day; I only piloted you down here," laughing at their discomfiture. Meanwhile the whole Corcoran brood had all gathered about the visitors, to rivet their gaze upon them, and wait patiently for further developments.
"Polly, you tell her," cried Alexia. "Yes, Polly, do," cried the other girls.
"Yes, Polly," said Pickering, "you can tell it the best."
"Oh, I never could," said Polly in dismay. "Jasper, you please." "No, Polly," said Van, "she's the best."
"But Polly doesn't wish to," said Jasper in a low voice.
"All right then, Jappy, go ahead," said Percy.
There was a little pause, Mrs. Corcoran filling it up by saying, "I can't ask you to sit down, for there aren't chairs enough," beginning to wipe off one with her apron. "Here, sir, if you'd please to sit," taking it over to Mr. King.
"Thank you," said the old gentleman, accepting it with his best air. "Now then, Jasper," he had handed a small parcel to him under cover of the chair wiping, "go ahead, my boy." So Jasper, seeing that there was no help for it, but that he was ready to be the spokesman, plunged in quite bravely. "Mrs. Corcoran, some of us girls and boys, we belong to two clubs, you know," waving his hand over to the representatives, "wanted to show your boys and girls that we were grateful to their father for being so good and kind to the passengers that night of the accident."
Here the little widow put the corner of her apron up to her eye, so Jasper hurried on.
"And we wanted to help them get an education, and so we had a little entertainment and sold the tickets, and here is our gift," Jasper ended desperately, thrusting the package out.
"Take it, Arethusa," was all Mrs. Corcoran could say, "and may the Lord bless you all." Then she put the apron over her head and sobbed aloud.
"Bless me!" exclaimed old Mr. King, fumbling for his handkerchief. "Don't, my good woman, I beg of you."
"And oh, I do hope you'll learn to play on the piano," breathed Polly, as Arethusa took the package from Jasper and slid it back to lay in her mother's hand. "Oh me, I'm going to cry!" exclaimed Alexia, backing off toward the door.
"If you do, I'll throw you out," said Joel savagely.
"Well, I shall. I feel so sniffly and queer. Oh, Joel, what shall I do? I shall be disgraced for life if I cry here."
"Hang on to me," said Joel stoutly, thrusting out his sturdy arm.
So Alexia hung on to it and managed to get along very well. And one of the children, the littlest one next to the baby, created a diversion by bringing up a mangy cat, and laying it on Mr. King's knees. This saved the situation as far as crying went, and brought safely away those who were perilously near the brink of tears. "Oh dear me!" exclaimed Polly, starting forward, knowing how Grandpapa detested cats. But Jasper was before her. "Let me take it, father," and he dexterously brought it off.
"Give it to me," said Polly. "Oh, what is its name?"
The little thing who seemed to own the cat toddled over, well pleased, and stuck his finger in his mouth, which was the extent to which he could go in conversation. But the other children, finding the ice now broken, all came up at this point to gather around Polly and the cat. "It's lucky enough that Phronsie isn't here," said Jasper in a low voice, "for she would never want to leave that cat."
"Just see Polly Pepper!" exclaimed Alexia, with a grimace. "Why doesn't she stop that dirty old cat?" "Because she ought not to," howled Joel sturdily.
Then he rushed over to Polly, and although he had small love for cats in general, this particular one, being extremely ill-favored and lean, met with his favor. He stroked her poor back. Arethusa drew near and gazed into Polly's face, seeing which, the cat was safely transferred to Joel, and Polly turned around to the girl.
"Oh, do you want to learn to play on the piano?"
asked Polly breathlessly, under cover of the noise going on, for all the other members of the two clubs now took a hand in it. Even Percy unbent enough to interview one of the Corcoran boys.
"Yes, I do," said Arethusa,
clasping her small red hands tightly. Her eyes widened, and her little thin face, which wasn't a bit pretty, lightened up now in a way that Polly thought was perfectly beautiful. "Well, I did when I was a little girl like you." Polly bent her rosy face very close to Arethusa's. "Oh, dreadfully, and I used to drum on the table to make believe I could play." "So did I," cried Arethusa, creeping up close to Polly's neck, "and the boys laugh at me, but I keep doing it." "And now, Arethusa, you are really going to learn to play on the piano." Polly thrilled all over at the announcement, just as she had done when told that she was to take music lessons. "Not a really and truly piano!" exclaimed Arethusa, lost in amazement. "Yes, a really and truly piano," declared Polly positively. "Just think, Arethusa, you can give music lessons and help take care of your mother." And just then Grandpapa, who had been talking to Mrs. Corcoran, was saying, "Well, well, it's time to be going, young people." And Joel put the cat down, then immediately ran between his legs, tripping him up as he turned, thereby making everybody laugh, and so the exit was made merrily. "Wasn't that fun?" cried Alexia, dancing off down the broken pavement. "Oh, I forgot, I'm going to walk home with Polly," and she flew back. "You take yourself away," cried old Mr. King with a laugh. "I'm to have Polly myself on this expedition." "Well, at any rate, Clem, you haven't, Polly," announced Alexia, as before, running up to her. "Neither have you," retorted Clem in the same way. "So we'll walk together," said Alexia, coolly possessing herself of Clem's arm. "Those two boys can walk with each other. They're just dying to." "How do you know I want to walk with you?" asked Clem abruptly. "Oh, but you do, you sweet thing. Come on!" and Alexia dragged her off at a smart pace. "Grandpapa!" cried Polly, hopping up and down by his side, too happy to keep still, while she clung to his hand just as Phronsie would have done. "You are going to have the piano put into the house the very first thing after it is cleaned and ready. The very first thing?" She peered around into his face anxiously. "The very first thing," declared the old gentleman. "Take my word for it, Polly, there shan't another article get in before it." "Oh, Grandpapa!" Polly wished she could go dancing off into the middle of the thoroughfare for a regular spin. "Take care, Polly," laughed old Mr. King, successfully steering her clear of an ash barrel. "This isn't the best dancing place imaginable." "Oh, I beg your pardon, Grandpapa," said Polly, trying to sober down. "I didn't mean to, but oh, isn't it perfectly beautiful that Arethusa is going to take music lessons?" "It is indeed," said Grandpapa, with a keen glance down at her flushed face. "And it really does seem to be an assured fact, for Miss Brown is engaged to begin as soon as the family move into their new home." "Oh, oh!" Polly could get no further. Jasper, ahead with Pickering Dodge, looked back longingly. "Oh, I do wish, Grandpapa," said Polly, "that Jasper could walk home with us." "So do I, Polly," said the old gentleman; "but you see he can't, for then I should have the whole bunch of those chattering creatures around me," and he laughed grimly. "You must tell him all about what we were talking of, as soon as you get home." "Yes, I will," declared Polly, "the very first thing. Now, Grandpapa, please go on." "Well, I had told Mrs. Corcoran all about the new house, you know, Polly, before." "Yes, I know, Grandpapa," said Polly, with a happy little wriggle. "And so to day I explained about the bank book, told her where the money was deposited, and showed her how to use it. By the way, Polly, Jasper made a good speech now, didn't he?" The old gentleman broke off, and fairly glowed with pride. "Oh, didn't he?" cried Polly in a burst. "I thought it was too splendid for anything. And he didn't know in the least that he had to do it. He thought you were going to give the bank book, Grandpapa." "I know it," chuckled Mr. King. "Well, now, Polly, I thought I'd try my boy without warning. Because, you see, that shows what stuff a person is made of to respond at such a time, and he's all right, Jasper is. He came up to the demand nicely." "It was perfectly elegant," cried Polly, with glowing cheeks. "And those two boys, the largest ones, are to begin in the other public school next week," continued the old gentleman. "Everything begins next week, doesn't it, Grandpapa?" cried Polly. "It seems so," said Mr. King with a laugh. "Well, Polly, here we are at our car." And having the good luck to find it nearly empty, the whole party hopped on, and began the ride back again. "Now," said Jasper, when they had reached home, "for some comfort," and he drew off Polly into a quiet corner in the library. "Let's have the whole, Polly. You said you'd tell me what you and Father were talking of all the way home." "And so I will," cried Polly, too elated to begin at the right end. "Well, Jasper, you must know that Arethusa's piano is actually engaged." "It is!" exclaimed Jasper. "Hurrah!"
Yes," said Polly with shining eyes, "and it's going into the new home the very first thing. Grandpapa promised me that."
"Isn't father good?" cried Jasper, a whole world of affection in his dark eyes.
"Good?" repeated Polly. "He's as good can be, Jasper King." "Well, what else?" cried Jasper. "And the boys, the two biggest ones, are going into the other public school, the one nearest their new home, you know."
"Yes, I see," said Jasper. "That's fine. That will bring them in with better boys."
"Yes, and Grandpapa told Mrs. Corcoran all about the money we made at the entertainment, and that he put it in the bank for her this morning. And he showed her how to use the check book."
"Polly," said Jasper, very much excited, "what if we girls and boys hadn't done this for those children? Just think, Polly, only suppose it."
"I know it," cried Polly. "Oh, Jasper!" drawing a long breath. "But then, you see, we did do it."
"Yes," said Jasper, bursting into a laugh, "we surely did, Polly." Chapter 21
of Five Little Peppers at School by Margaret Sidney. Chapter 21 At the Play. "Oh, Kathy!" Polly rushed out to meet the girl that Johnson was just ushering in. "I am so glad you've come." A pleased look swept over the girl's face, but she didn't say anything. "Now come right upstairs, never mind the bag. Johnson will bring that for you."
"I will take it up, miss," said Johnson, securing it.
"Mamma is waiting to see you," cried Polly, as they ran over the stairs, Kathy trying to still the excited beating of her heart at the thought that she was really to visit Polly Pepper for 3 whole days. "Oh, Mamsie, here she is!"
"I'm glad to see you, Kathy," said Mrs. Fisher heartily, taking her cold hand. "Now you are to have the room right next to Polly's."
"Yes, the same one that Alexia always has when she stays here," said Polly. "See, Kathy," bearing her off down the hall. "Oh, it is so good to get you here!" she cried happily. "Well, here we are." "You can't think," began Kathy brokenly, then she turned away to the window. "It's so good of you to ask me, Polly Pepper." "It's so good of you to come," said Polly merrily, and running over to her. "There, Johnson has brought your bag. Aren't you going to unpack it, Kathy? That is, I mean," with a little laugh, "after you've got your hat and jacket off. And then, when your things are all settled, we can go downstairs and do whatever you like. Perhaps we'll go in the greenhouse." "Oh, Polly!" exclaimed Kathy, quite forgetting herself and turning round. "And I can't help you unpack?" asked Polly, longing to do something. "No," said Kathy, remembering her plain clothes and lack of the pretty trifles that girls delight in; then seeing Polly's face, she thought better of it. "Yes, you may," she said suddenly. So Polly unstrapped the bag and drew out the clothes, all packed very neatly. "Why, Kathy Harrison!" she exclaimed suddenly. "What?" asked Kathy, hanging up her jacket in the closet and putting her head around the door. "Oh, what a lovely thing!" Polly held up a little carved box of Chinese workmanship. "Isn't it?" cried Kathy, well pleased that she had anything worthy of notice. "My uncle brought that from China to my mother when she was a little girl, and she gave it to me." "Well, it's too lovely for anything," declared Polly, running to put it on the toilet table. "I do think Chinese carvings are so pretty." "Do you?" cried Kathy, well pleased. "My mother has some really fine ones. I'll show you sometime if you'd like to see them, Polly." "Indeed I should," said Polly warmly. So Kathy, delighted that she really had something that could interest Polly Pepper, hurried through her preparations, and then the two went downstairs arm in arm and out to the greenhouse. "Polly Pepper!" exclaimed Kathy on the threshold, "I don't think I should ever envy you living in that perfectly beautiful house, because it just scares me to set foot in it." "Well, it needn't," said Polly with a little laugh. "You must just forget all about it being big and splendid." "But I can't," said Kathy, surprised at herself for being so communicative, "because, you see, I live in such a little tucked up place." "Well, so did I," said Polly with a bob of her brown head, "before we came here to Grandpapa's; but oh, you can't think how beautiful it was in the little brown house. You can't begin to think, Kathy Harrison." "I know," said Kathy, who had heard the story before. "I wish you'd tell it all to me now, Polly." "I couldn't tell it all if I talked a year, I guess," said Polly merrily. "And there is Turner waiting to speak to me. Come on, Kathy."
and she ran down the long aisle between the fragrant blossoms. But Kathy stopped to look and exclaim so often to herself that she made slow progress. "Shall I make her up a bunch, Miss Mary?" asked old Turner, touching his cap respectfully and looking at the visitor.
"Oh, if you please!" cried Polly radiantly, "and do put some heliotrope in, for Kathy is so fond of that. And please let her have a bunch every morning when I have mine, Turner, for she is to stay 3 days."
"It shall be as you wish, Miss Mary," said Turner, quite delighted at the order.
"And please let it be very nice, Turner," said Polly hastily.
"I will, miss, don't fear, Miss Mary, I'll have it as nice as possible," as Polly ran off to meet Kathy.
"I should stay here every single minute I was at home if I lived here, Polly Pepper," declared Kathy. "Oh, oh," sniffing at each discovery of a new blossom. "Oh, no, you wouldn't, Kathy," contradicted Polly with a laugh. "Not if you had to get your lessons, and practice on the piano, and go out riding and driving, and play with the boys." "Oh, dear me!" cried Kathy. "I don't care very much for boys, because you see, Polly, I never know what in this world to say to them." "That's because you never had any brothers," said Polly, feeling how very dreadful such a state must be. "I can't imagine anything without Ben and Joel and Davy. And now you've such a lot of brothers, with Jasper and all those Whitney boys. Oh, Polly, don't they scare you to death sometimes?" Polly burst into such a merry peal of laughter that they neither of them heard the rushing feet until Kathy glanced up. "Oh, dear me, there they are now!" "Well, to be sure, we might have known you were here, Polly," cried Jasper, dashing up with Clare. "How do you do, Kathy?" putting out his hand cordially. Clare gave her a careless nod, then turned to Polly. "It's to be fine," he said. "What?" asked Polly wonderingly. "Hold on, old chap." Jasper gave him a clap on the back. "Father is going to tell her himself. Come on, Polly and Kathy, to his room." "Come, Kathy," cried Polly. "Let's beat those boys," she said, when once out of the greenhouse. "We're going to race," she cried over her shoulder. "Is that so?" said Jasper. "Clare, we must beat them," and they dashed in pursuit. But they couldn't. The two girls flew over the lawn, and reached the stone steps just a breathing space before Jasper and Clare plunged up. "Well done!" cried Jasper, tossing back the hair from his forehead. "I didn't know you could run so well," observed Clare, with some show of interest in Kathy. "Oh, she runs splendidly," said Polly, with sparkling eyes. "Let's try a race sometime, Jasper, we 4, down the long path, while Kathy's here." "Capital, we will," assented Jasper. "But now for Father's room." There sat old Mr. King by his writing table. "Well, Polly, how do you do, Kathy? I'm glad to see you," he said, putting out his hand kindly. As well as she could for her terror at being actually in that stately Mr. King's presence, Kathy stumbled forward and laid her hand in his. "Now, Polly," said the old gentleman, turning off to pick up a little envelope lying on the table, "I thought perhaps you would like to take your young friend to the play to-night, so I have the tickets for us 5, with a sweep of his hand over to the two boys. "Grandpapa!" cried Polly, precipitating herself into his arms. "Oh, how good you are!" which pleased the old gentleman immensely. "Isn't that no end fine?" cried Jasper, in delight. "Father, we can't thank you." "Say no more, my boy," cried the old gentleman. "I'm thanked enough. And so, Polly, my girl, you like it?" patting her brown hair. "Like it!" cried Polly, lifting her glowing cheeks. "Oh, Grandpapa!" "Run along with you, then, all of you. Clare, be over in time." "Yes, sir," cried Clare. "Oh, thank you, Mr. King, ever so much," as they all scampered off to get their lessons for the next day, for going to a play was always a special treat, on condition that no studies were neglected. "Oh, Kathy," cried Polly, before she flew into the window seat to curl up with her books, her favorite place for studying her lessons, "Grandpapa is taking us to the play because you're here." "And I've never been to a play, Polly," said Kathy, perfectly overwhelmed with it all. "Haven't you? Oh, I'm so glad. I'm glad you're going with us, and that Grandpapa is to take you to the first one. But oh me!" and Polly rushed off to attack her books. "Now don't let us speak a single word, Kathy Harrison," as Kathy picked out a low rocker for her choice of a seat, and pretty soon, if Miss Salisbury herself had come into the room, she would have been perfectly satisfied with the diligent attention the books were receiving. But Miss Salisbury was not thinking of her pupils this afternoon. She was at this moment closeted with Miss Anstice, and going over a conversation that they frequently held, these past days, without much variation in the subject or treatment.
"If there were anything we could do to repay him, sister," said Miss Anstice mournfully, "I'd do it, and spend my last cent. But what is there?" Then she paced the floor with her mincing little steps, now quite nervous and flurried. "Sister," said Miss Salisbury, doing her best to be quite calm, "it isn't a matter of payment, for whatever we did, we never could hope to replace that exquisite little vase. Miss Clemcy had pointed out to me the fact that it was quite the gem in his collection." "I know. I thought my heart would stop when I heard the crash." Miss Anstice wrung her little hands together at the memory. "Oh, that careless Lily!" "Sister, pray let us look at this matter." "I am looking at it. I see nothing but that vase, smashed to pieces, and I cannot sleep at night for fear I'll dream about how it looked in those very little bits." "Sister, pray." "And if you want me to tell you what I think should be done, I'm sure I can't say," added Miss Anstice helplessly. "Well, then, I must think," declared Miss Salisbury with sudden energy, "for some repayment must surely be made to him, although they utterly refused it when you and I called and broached the subject to them." "It was certainly a most unfortunate day from beginning to end," said Miss Anstice with a suggestion of tears in her voice, and a shiver at the remembrance of the front breadth of her gown. "Sister, I hope and pray that you will never have another picnic for the school." "I cannot abolish that annual custom, Anstice," said Miss Salisbury firmly, "for the girls get so much enjoyment out of it. They are already talking about the one to come next year." "Ugh!" shuddered Miss Anstice. "And anything that holds an influence over them I must sustain. You know that yourself, sister, and it is most important to give them some recreations." "But picnics!" Miss Anstice held up her little hands as if quite unequal to any words. "And I am very sorry that we were out when Mr. Clemcy and his sister called yesterday afternoon, for I am quite sure I could have arranged matters so that we need not feel under obligations to them." Miss Anstice, having nothing to say, kept her private recollections mournfully to herself, and it being the hour for the boarding pupils to go out to walk, and her duty to accompany them, the conference broke up. "Polly," called Mrs. Chatterton, as Polly ran past her door, her opera glasses Grandpapa had given her last Christmas in the little plush bag dangling from her arm, and a happy light in her eyes. Kathy had gone downstairs, and it was getting nearly time to set forth for that enchanted land, the playhouse. Polly ran on, scarcely conscious that she was called. "Did you not hear me?" asked Mrs. Chatterton angrily, coming to her door. "Oh, I beg pardon," said Polly, really glad, ever since that dreadful time when Mrs. Chatterton was ill, to do anything for her. "For I never shall forget how naughty I was to her," Polly said over to herself now as she turned back. "You may well beg my pardon," said Mrs. Chatterton, "for of all ill-bred girls you certainly are the worst. I want you." Then she disappeared within her room. "What is it?" asked Polly, coming in. "I shall be so glad to help." "Help!" repeated Mrs. Chatterton in scorn. She was standing over by her toilet table. "You can serve me. Come here." The hot blood mounted to Polly's brow. Then she thought, "Oh, what did I say? That I would do anything for Mrs. Chatterton if she would only forgive me for those dreadful words I said to her." And she went over and stood by the toilet table. "Oh, you have concluded to come," observed Mrs. Chatterton scornfully. "So much the better it would be if you could always learn what your place is in this house. There, you see this lace?" She shook out her flowing sleeve, glad to display her still finely moulded arm, that had been one of her chief claims to distinction, even if nobody but this little country-bred girl saw it. Polly looked at the dangling lace, evidently just torn, with dismay. Seeing which, Mrs. Chatterton broke out sharply, "Get the basket, girl, over there on the table, and sew it as well as you can." "Polly!" called Jasper over the stairs. "Where are you?" Polly trembled all over as she hurried across the room to get the sewing basket. Grandpapa was not ready, she knew, but she always ran down a little ahead for the fun of the last moments waiting with Jasper, when old Mr. King was going to take them out of an evening. And in the turmoil in her mind she didn't observe that Hortense had misplaced the basket, putting it on the low bookcase, and was still searching all over the table as directed, when Mrs. Chatterton's sharp voice filled her with greater dismay. "Stupid! If you would put heart into your search, it would be easy enough to find it." "Polly, where are you?" Polly, in her haste not to displease Mrs. Chatterton by replying to Jasper before finding the basket, knocked over one of the small silver-topped bottles with which the dressing table seemed to be full, and before she could rescue it, it fell to the floor. "Go out of this room!" commanded Mrs. Chatterton with blazing eyes. "I ought to have known better than to call upon a heavy-handed, low-born country girl to do a delicate service." "I didn't mean—" began poor Polly. "Go out of this room!" Mrs. Chatterton, now thoroughly out of temper, so far forgot herself as to stamp her foot, and Polly, feeling as if she had lost all chance in her future encounters with Mrs. Chatterton of atoning for past shortcomings, went sadly out, to meet just beside the door Jasper, with amazement on his face. "Oh, Polly, I thought you were never coming." Then he saw her face. "That old—" he said under his breath. "Polly, don't ever go into her room again. I wouldn't," as they hurried off downstairs. "She won't let me," said Polly, her head drooping, and the brightness all gone from her face. "She won't ever let me go again, I know." "Won't let you? Well, I guess you'll not give her a chance," cried Jasper hotly. "Polly, I do really wish that Father would tell her to go away."
"Oh, Jasper!" cried Polly in alarm. "Don't say one word to Grandpapa. Promise me you won't, Jasper."
"Well, Father is tired of her. She wears on him terribly, Polly," said Jasper gloomily.
"I know," said Polly sadly. "And oh, Jasper, if you say one word, he will really have her go. And I was so bad to her, you know," and the tears came into Polly's brown eyes.
"Well, she must have been perfectly terrible to you," said Jasper. "Polly! Jasper! Where are you?" came in old Mr. King's voice.
"Here, Father," and "Here, Grandpapa," and Clare running up the steps, the little party was soon in the carriage. "Promise me, Jasper, do," implored Polly, when Grandpapa was explaining to Cathie about the great actor they were to see, and Clare was listening to hear all about it, too. "Oh, I won't," promised Jasper, "if you don't wish me to." "I really wouldn't have you for all the world," declared Polly, and now that this fear was off from her mind, she began to pick up her old bright spirits, so that by the time the carriage stopped at the theatre, Polly was herself again. Jasper watched her keenly, and drew a long breath when he saw her talking and laughing with Grandpapa.
"You are going to sit next to me, Polly," said the old gentleman, marshalling his forces when well within. "And Jasper next. Then, Cathie, you will have a knight on either side."
"Oh, I can't sit between two boys!" cried Cathie, forgetting herself in her terror.
"I won't bite you," cried Clare saucily. "I will see that Clare behaves himself," said Jasper. "You'll do nicely, my dear," said Mr. King encouragingly to her, then proceeded down the aisle after the usher. So there was nothing to do but obey. And Cathie, who would have found it a formidable thing to be stranded on the companionship of one boy, found herself between two, and Polly Pepper far off, and not the least able to help. "Now then," said Jasper, taking up the program, "I suppose Father told you pretty much all that was necessary to know about Irving. Well," and then, without waiting for a reply, Jasper dashed on about the splendid plays in which he had seen this wonderful actor, and the particular one they were about to enjoy to-night, and from that he drifted off to the fine points to be admired in the big playhouse, with its striking decorations, and making Cathie raise her eyes to take it all in, until Clare leaned over to say, "I should think you might give Cathie and me a chance to talk a little, Jasper."
"Oh, I don't want to talk," cried Cathie in terror. "I don't know anything to say."
"Well, I do," said Clare, in a dudgeon, "only Jasper goes on in such a streak to-night." "I believe I have been talking you both blue," said Jasper, with a laugh. "You certainly have," said Clare, laughing too. And then Cathie laughed, and Polly Pepper, looking over, beamed at her, for she had begun to be worried. "The best thing in the world," said old Mr. King, "was to turn her over to those two boys. Now don't give her another thought, Polly, she'll get on." And she did, so well that before long she and Clare were chatting away merrily, and Cathie felt it was by no means such a very terrible experience to be sitting between two boys at a play. And by the time the evening was half over she was sure that she liked it very much. And Polly beamed at her more than ever, and Jasper felt quite sure that he had never enjoyed an evening more than the one at present, flying by so fast. And old Mr. King, so handsome and stately, showed such evident pride in his young charges, as he smiled and chatted, that more than one old friend in the audience commented on it. "Did you ever see such a change in any one?" asked the Dowager, levelling her keen glances from her box down upon the merry party. "Never. It was the one thing needed to make him quite perfect," said another one of that set. "He is approachable now, absolutely fascinating, so genial and courteous." "His manners were perfect before," said a third member of the box party, "except they needed thawing out, a bit too icy." "You are too mild. I should say they were quite frozen. He never seemed to me to have any heart." "Well, it's proved he has," observed her husband. I tell you that little Pepper girl is going to make a sensation when she comes out," leaning over for a better view of the King party. "And the best of it is that she doesn't know it herself." And Clare made up his mind that Kathy Harrison was an awfully nice girl, and he was real glad she had moved to town and joined the Salisbury School. And as he had 2 cousins there, they soon waked up a conversation over them. "Only I don't know them much," said Kathy. "You see, I haven't been at the school long, and besides, the girls didn't have much to say to me till Polly Pepper said nice things to me, and then she asked me to go to the bee." "That old sewing thing where they make clothes for the poor little darkies down south?" asked Clare. "Yes, and it's just lovely," said Kathy, "and I never supposed I'd be asked. And Polly Pepper came down to my desk one day and invited me to come to the next meeting, and I was so scared I couldn't say anything at first, and then Polly got me into the Salisbury Club." "Oh, yes, I know." Clare nodded, and wished he could forget how he had asked one of the other boys on that evening when the 2 clubs united, why in the world the Salisbury Club elected Kathy Harrison into its membership. "And then Polly Pepper's mother invited me to visit her, Polly, I mean, and so here I am." She forgot she was talking to a dreaded boy, and turned her happy face toward him. "And it's just lovely. I never visited a girl before." "Never visited a girl before?" repeated Clare in astonishment. "No," said Kathy. "You see, my father was a minister, and we lived in the country, and when I visited anybody, which was only 2 or 3 times in my life, it was to Papa's old aunts." "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Clare faintly, quite gone in pity. "And so your father moved to town," he said, and then he knew that he had made a terrible mistake. "Now she won't speak a word, perhaps burst out crying," he groaned within himself as he saw her face. But Kathy sat quite still. "My papa died," she said softly, "and he told mamma before he went to take me to town and have me educated, and one of those old aunts gave the money, and if it hadn't been for him I'd have run home from the Salisbury School that first week, it was so perfectly awful." Clare sat quite still, then he burst out, "Well now, Kathy, I think it was just splendid in you to stick on." "Do you?" she cried, quite astonished to think anyone would think she was "just splendid" in anything. "Why, the girls call me a goose over and over, and sometimes I lose my temper because they don't say it in fun, but they really mean it." "Well, they needn't," said Clare indignantly, "because I don't think you're a goose at all." "Those 2 are getting on quite well," said Jasper to Polly. "I don't think we need to worry about Kathy any more." "And isn't she nice?" asked Polly, with great delight. "Yes, I think she is, Polly," said Jasper, in a way that gave Polly great satisfaction. But when this delightful evening was all over, and the good nights had been said, and Mother Fisher, as was her wont, had come into Polly's room to help her take off her things, and to say a few words to Kathy too, Polly began to remember the scene in Mrs. Chatterton's room, and a sorry little feeling crept into her heart. And when Mamsie had gone out and everything was quiet, Polly buried her face in her pillow and tried not to cry. "I don't believe she will ever forgive me, or let me help her again." "Polly," called Kathy softly from the next room, "I did have the most beautiful time." "Did you?" cried Polly, choking back her sobs. "Oh, I'm so glad, Kathy." "Yes," said Kathy, "and I did, Polly, and I'm not afraid of boys now. I think they're real nice." "Aren't they?" cried Polly, "and weren't our seats fine? Grandpapa didn't want a box tonight, because we could see the play so much better from the floor. But we ought to go to sleep, Kathy, for Mamsie wouldn't like us to talk. Good night." "Good night," said Kathy. "A box," she said to herself as she turned on her pillow. "Oh, I should have died to have sat up in one of those. It was quite magnificent enough where I was." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of 5 Little Peppers at School, by Margaret Sidney. Recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. Pickering Dodge. Jasper, rushing down the long hall of the Pemberton School, books in hand, turned to see Mr. Faber standing in the doorway of his private room. "I want to see you, Jasper." Jasper, with an awful feeling at his heart, obeyed and went in. "It's all up with Pick," he groaned, and sat down in the place indicated on the other side of the big round table, Mr. Faber in his accustomed seat, the big leather chair. "You remember the conversation I had with you, Jasper," he said slowly, and picking up a paper knife, he began playing with it, occasionally glancing up over his glasses at the boy. Jasper nodded, unable to find any voice. Then he managed to say, "Yes, sir." "Well now, Jasper, it was rather an unusual thing to do, to set one lad, as it were, to work upon another in just that way. For I am sure I haven't forgotten my boyhood, long past as it is, and I realize that the responsibilities of school life are heavy enough without adding to the burden." Mr. Faber, well pleased with this sentiment, waited to clear his throat. Jasper, in an agony as he saw Pickering Dodge expelled, and all the dreadful consequences, sat quite still. "At the same time, although I disliked to take you into confidence, making you an assistant in the work of reclaiming Pickering Dodge from his idle, aimless state, in which he exhibited such a total disregard for his lessons, it appeared after due consideration to be the only thing left to be done. You understand this, I trust, Jasper?" Jasper's reply this time was so low as to be scarcely audible, but Mr. Faber, taking it for granted, manipulated the paper knife a few times, and went on impressively. "I am very glad you do, Jasper. I felt sure, knowing you so well, that my reasons would appeal to you in the right way. You are Pickering's best friend among my scholars."
"And he is mine!" exploded Jasper, thinking wildly that it was perhaps not quite too late to save Pickering. "I've known him always, sir." He was quite to the edge of his chair now, his dark eyes shining and his hair tossed back. "Beg pardon, Mr. Faber, but I can't help it. Pickering is so fine. He's not like the other boys."
"No, I believe you." Mr. Faber smiled grimly and gave the paper knife another whirl. And much as Jasper liked him, that smile seemed wholly unnecessary, and to deal death to his hopes. "He certainly is unlike any other boy in my school in regard to his studying," he said. "His capacity is not wanting, to be sure; there never was any lack of that. For that reason I was always hoping to arouse his ambition."
"And you can, oh, you can, sir!" cried Jasper eagerly, although he felt every word he said to be unwelcome. "If you will only try him a bit longer. Don't send him off yet, Mr. Faber."
He got off from his chair and leaned on the table heavily. "Don't send him off," repeated Mr. Faber, dropping the paper knife. "What is the boy talking of? Why, Jasper, I've called you in here to tell you how much Pickering has improved, and—" Jasper collapsed on his chair. "And is it possible that you haven't seen it for yourself, Jasper?" exclaimed Mr. Faber. "Why, every teacher is quite delighted, even Mr. Dinsmore, and he was in favor of at least suspending Pickering last half, has expressed his opinion that I did well to give the boy another trial." "I thought," mumbled Jasper, "I was afraid." Then he pulled himself together, and somehow found himself standing over by Mr. Faber's chair, unbosoming himself of his fright and corresponding joy. "Pull your chair up nearer, Jasper," said Mr. Faber, when the first transport having worked off, Jasper seemed better fitted for conversation, "and we will go over this in a more intelligent fashion. I am really more pleased than I can express at the improvement in that boy. As I said before," Mr. Faber had long ago thrown aside the paper knife, and now turned toward Jasper, his whole attention on the matter in hand, "Pickering has a fine capacity; take it all in all, perhaps there is none better in the whole school. It shows to great advantage now, because he has regained his place so rapidly in his classes. It is quite astonishing, Jasper." And he took off his glasses and polished them up carefully, repeating several times during the process, "Yes, very surprising indeed."
"And he seems to like to study now," said Jasper, ready to bring forward all the nice things that warranted encouragement.
"Does he so?" Mr. Faber set his glasses on his nose, and beamed at him over them. The boys at the Pemberton school always protested that this was the only use they could be put to on the master's countenance. "Well now, Jasper, I really believe I am justified in entertaining a very strong hope of Pickering's future career. And I see no reason why he should not be ready for college with you, and without conditions, if he will only keep his ambition alive and active, now it is aroused."
"May I tell him so?" cried Jasper, almost beside himself with joy. "Oh, may I, Mr. Faber?"
"Why, that is what I called you in for, Jasper," said the master. "It seemed so very much better for him to hear it from a boy, for I remember my own boyhood, though so very long since, and the effect will, I feel sure, be much deeper than if Pickering hears it from me. He is very tired of this study, Jasper," and Mr. Faber glanced around at the four walls, and again came that grim smile. "And even to hear a word of commendation, it might not be so pleasing to be called in. So away with you. At the proper time I shall speak to him myself." Jasper, needing no second bidding, fled precipitately, dashed in again. "Beg pardon, I'd forgotten my books." He seized them from the table and made quick time tracking Pickering. "Where is Pick?" rushing up to a knot of boys on a corner of the playground, just separating to go home.
"Dunno. What's up, King?"
"Can't stop," said Jasper, flying back to the schoolroom. "I must get Pick."
"Dodge is gone!"
shouted a boy clearing the steps, who had heard the last words. So Jasper, turning again, left school and playground far behind, to run up to the steps of the Cabot mansion. "Pickering here?" Yes. The butler had seen him hurrying over the stairs to his own room just 5 minutes ago. And in less than a minute Jasper was up in that same place. There sat Pickering by his table, his long legs upon its surface, and his hands thrust into his pockets. His books sprawled just where he had thrown them, at different angles along the floor. "Hullo!" cried Jasper, flying in, to stop aghast at this.
"Yes, you see, Jasper, I'm played out," said Pickering. "It isn't any use for me to study, and there are the plaguey things," pulling out one set of fingers to point to the sprawling books. "I can't catch up. Every teacher looks at me squint-eyed as if I were a hopeless case, which I am."
"Oh, you big dunce!" Jasper clapped his books on the table with a bang, making Pickering draw down his long legs, rushed around to precipitate himself on the rest of the figure in the chair, when he pommeled him to his heart's content.
"If you expect to beat any hope into me, old boy," cried Pickering, not caring in the least for the onslaught, "you'll miss your guess." "I'm hoping to beat sense into you," cried Jasper, pounding away. "Though it looks almost impossible now," he declared, laughing. "Pick, you've won. Mr. Faber says you've come up in classes splendidly, and—" Pickering sprang to his feet.
"What do you mean, Jasper?" he cried hoarsely, his face white as a sheet.
"Just what I say."
"Say it again." So Jasper went all over it once more, adding the other things about getting into college and all that, as much as Pickering would hear. "Honest?" he broke in, his pale face getting a dull red, and seizing Jasper by the shoulders.
"Did I ever tell you anything that wasn't so, Pick?"
"No, but I can't believe it, Jap. It's the first time in my life I've And what incessant blame could not do, praise achieved. Pickering rushed to the bed, flung himself face down upon it, and broke into a torrent of sobs. Jasper, who had never seen Pickering cry, had wild thoughts of rushing for Mrs. Cabot. The uncle was not at home. But remembering how little good this could possibly do, he bent all his energies to stop this unlooked-for flood. But he was helpless. Having never given way in this manner before, Pickering seemed determined to make a thorough job of it. And it was not till he was quite exhausted that he rolled over, wiped his eyes, and looked at Jasper. "I'm through," he announced.
"I should think you might well be," retorted Jasper. "What with scaring me almost to death, you've made yourself a fright, Pick, and you've just upset all your chances to study today."
Pickering flung himself off the bed as summarily as he had got on. "That's likely, isn't it?" he cried mockingly, and shamefacedly scrabbling up the books from the floor. "Now then," and he was across the room, pouring out a basinful of water, to thrust his swollen face within it. "Whew! I never knew it used to chaps up so to cry," he spluttered. "Goodness me!" He withdrew his countenance from the towel to regard Jasper. "How you look!" cried Jasper, considering it better to rail at him. Whereupon Pickering found his way to the long mirror. "I never was a beauty," he said. "And now you're less," laughed Jasper. "But I'm good," said Pickering solemnly, and flinging himself down to his books. "You can't study with such eyes," cried Jasper, tugging at the book. "Clear out!" "I'm not going. Pick, your eyes aren't much bigger than pins." "But they're sharp, just as pins are. Leave me alone." Pickering squirmed all over his chair, but Jasper had the book. "Never mind, I'll fly at my history then," said Pickering, possessing himself of another book. "That's the beauty of it. I am as backward in all of my lessons as I am in one. I can strike in anywhere." "You're not backward in any now," cried Jasper in glee, and performing an Indian war dance around the table. "Forward is the word henceforth," he brought up dramatically, with another lunge at Pickering. "Get out, you better go home." "I haven't the smallest intention of going," replied Jasper, and successfully coming off with a second book. "Here's for book number 3," declared Pickering, but too late. Jasper seized the remaining 2, tossed them back of him, then squared off. "Come on for a tussle, old fellow. You're not fit to study. Ruin your eyes. Come on," his whole face sparkling. It was too much. The table was pushed one side, books and lessons, Mr. Faber and college were as things never heard of, and for a good quarter of an hour Pickering, whose hours of exercise had been much scantier of late, was hard pushed to parry all Jasper's attacks. At the last, when the little clock on the mantel struck 4, he came out ahead. "I declare, that was a good one!" he exclaimed in a glow. "Particularly so to you," said Jasper ruefully. "You gave me a regular bear hug, you scamp." "Had to pay you up." "And now you may study," cried Jasper gaily, and snatching his books he ran off. "Oh, Pick!" putting his head in at the door. "Yes?" "If the lessons are done, come over this evening, will you?" "All right." The last sound of Jasper's feet on the stairs reached Pickering when he suddenly left his chair and flew into the hall. "Jap! Oh, I say, Jap!" Then he plunged back into his room to thrust his head out of the window. "Jap!" he howled, to the consternation of a fat old gentleman passing beneath, who, on account of his size, finding it somewhat inconvenient to look up, therefore waddled into the street and surveyed the house gravely. Pickering slammed down the window, leaving the old gentleman to stare as long as he saw fit. "I can't go over there to-night, looking like this." He pranced up to the mirror again, fuming every step of the way, and surveyed himself in dismay. There was some improvement in the appearance of his countenance, to be sure, but not by any means enough to please him. His pale blue eyes were so small, and their surroundings so swollen, that they reminded him of nothing so much as those of a small pig he had made acquaintance with in a visit up in the country, while his nose, long and usually quite aristocratic looking, had resigned all claims to distinction, and was hopelessly pudgy. "Jasper knows I can't go in this shape," he cried in a fury. "Great Caesar's ghost, I never supposed it banged a fellow up so to cry just once." And the next moments were spent in sopping his face violently with the wet towel, which did no good, as it had been plentifully supplied with that treatment before. At last he flung himself into his chair. "If I don't go over, Jap will think I haven't my lessons, so that's all right. And I won't have them anyway if I don't tackle them pretty quick. So here goes." And presently the only sound to be heard was the ticking of the little clock, varied by the turning of his pages, or the rattling of the paper on which he was working out the problems for to-morrow.
"Oh, dear me, Jasper!" Polly exclaimed about 7:30. "I don't believe Pickering is coming."
"He hasn't his lessons, I suppose," said Jasper. "You know I told him to come over as soon as they were done. Well, Polly, we agreed, you know, to let him alone as to invitations until the lessons were out of the way, so I won't go over after him."
"I know," said Polly, "but oh, Jasper, isn't it just too elegant for anything to think that Mr. Faber says it's all right with him?" "I should think it was!" cried Jasper. "Now if he only keeps on, Polly." "Oh, he must, he will," declared Polly, confidently. "Well, we can put off toasting marshmallows until to-morrow night." About this time Pickering, whose lessons were all done, for he had, as Mr. Faber said, a fine capacity to learn, was receiving company just when he thought he was safe from showing his face. "Let's stop for Pickering Dodge," proposed Alexia, Clare having run in for her to go over to Polly Pepper's, "to toast marshmallows and have fun generally."
"All right, so we can," cried Clare. So they turned the corner and went down to the Cabot mansion, and were let in before the old butler could be stopped. Pickering, whose uncle and aunt were out for the evening, had felt it safe to throw himself down on the library sofa. When he saw that John had forgotten what he told him, not to let anybody in, he sprang up, but not before Alexia, rushing in, had cried, "Oh, here you are! Come on with us to Polly Pepper's!" Clare dashed in after her. "Ow!" exclaimed Pickering, seizing a sofa pillow to jam it against his face.
"What is the matter?" cried Alexia. "Oh, have you a toothache?"
"Worse than that," groaned Pickering behind his pillow.
"Oh, my goodness me!" exclaimed Alexia, tumbling back. "What can it be?"
"You haven't broken your jaw, Pick," observed Clare. "I can't imagine that."
"I'll break yours if you don't go," said Pickering savagely, and half smothered, as he tried to keep the pillow well before the two pairs of eyes.
This was a little difficult, as Clare, seeing hopes of running around the pillow, set himself in motion to that end. But as Pickering whirled as fast as he did, there was no great gain.
"Well, if I ever did!" exclaimed Alexia, quite aghast.
And the next moment Pickering, keeping a little opening at one end of the pillow, saw his chance, darted out of the door, and flinging the pillow the length of the hall, raced into his own room and slammed the door, and they could hear him lock it. "Well, if I ever did!" exclaimed Alexia again, and sinking into the first chair, she raised both hands. "What's got into the beggar?" cried Clare in perplexity, and looking out into the hall, as if some help to the puzzle might be found there. "Well, I guess you and I, Alexia, might as well go to Polly Pepper's," he said finally. "And if I ever come after that boy again to tell him of anything nice that's going to happen, I miss my guess," declared Alexia, getting herself out of her chair, in high dudgeon. "Let's send Jasper after him. He's the only one who can manage him," she cried, as they set forth. "Good idea," said Clare. But when Alexia told of their funny reception, Jasper first stared, then burst out laughing. And although Alexia teased and teased, she got no satisfaction. "It's no use, Alexia," Jasper said, wiping his eyes. "You won't get me to tell. So let's set about having some fun. What shall we do?" "I don't want to do anything," pouted Alexia, "only to know what made Pickering Dodge act in that funny way." "And that's just what you won't know, Alexia," replied Jasper composedly. "Well, Polly, you are going to put off toasting the marshmallows, aren't you? Till tomorrow night, when Pick can probably come?" "Oh, I wouldn't wait for him," Alexia burst out, quite exasperated, "when he's acted so. And perhaps he'd come with an old sofa pillow before his face, if you did." "Oh, no, he won't, Alexia," said Jasper, going off into another laugh. But although she teased again, she got no nearer to the facts. And Polly proposing that they make candy, the chafing dish was gotten out, and Alexia, who was quite an adept in the art, went to work, Jasper cracking the nuts, and Polly and Clare picking out the meats. And then all the story of Pickering's splendid advance in the tough work of making up his lessons came out, Jasper pausing so long to dilate with kindling eyes upon it, that very few nuts fell into the dish. So Polly's fingers were the only ones to achieve much, as Clare gave so close attention to the story that he was a very poor helper. In the midst of it, Alexia threw down the chafing dish spoon and clapped her hands. "Oh, I know!" she exclaimed. "Oh!" cried Polly, looking up from the little pile of nut meats. "How you scared me, Alexia!" I know!" exclaimed Alexia again, and nodding to herself wisely. Jasper threw her a quick glance. It said, "If you know, don't tell, Alexia." And she flashed back, "Did you suppose I would?" "What do you know?" demanded Clare, transferring his attention from Jasper to her. "Tell on, Alexia, what do you know?" "Oh, my goodness me, this candy never will be done in time for those meats," cried Alexia, picking up the spoon to stir away for dear life, and Jasper dashed in on what Mr. Faber said about Pickering's chances for college, a statement that completely carried Clare off his feet, so to speak. "You don't mean that he thinks Pick will get in without conditions?" gasped Clare, dumbfounded. "Yes, I do," Jasper nodded brightly. "If Pick will only study, keep it up, you know, I mean to the end. He surely said it, Clare." It was so much for Clare to think of that he didn't have any words at his command. "Now isn't that perfectly splendid in Pickering?" cried Alexia, making the spoon fly merrily. "Oh, dear me, I forgot to put in the butter. Where? Oh, here it is," and she tossed in a big piece. "To think that oh, dear me, I forgot. I did put the butter in before. Now I've spoilt it," and she threw down the spoon in despair. "Fish it out!" cried Polly, hopping up and seizing the spoon to make little dabs at the ball of butter now rapidly lessening. "But it's melted, that is, almost. Oh, dear me!" cried Alexia. "No, it isn't. There, see how big it is." Polly landed it deftly on the plate, and hopped back to her nut meats again. "And I should think you'd better shake yourself, Clare," said Jasper over at him. "We shouldn't have any nuts in this candy if it depended on you." "You do tell such astounding stories," cried Clare, setting to work at once. And Jasper making as much noise as he could while cracking his nuts, Alexia's secret was safe. But when the candy was set out to cool, and there was a pause in which the two boys were occupied by themselves, Alexia pulled Polly off to a corner. "Where are they going?" asked Clare, with one eye after them. "Oh, they have something to talk over, I presume," said Jasper carelessly. "Nonsense! They've all the time every day. Let's go over and see." "Oh, no," said Jasper. "Come on, Clare, and let's see if the candy is cool." But Clare didn't want to see if the candy was cool, nor anything else but to have his own way. So he proceeded over to the corner by himself. "Oh, no, you go right away," cried Alexia, poking her head up over Polly's shoulder. "You dreadful boy! Now, Polly, come." And she pulled her off into the library. "You see you didn't get anything for your pains," said Jasper, bursting into a laugh. "You'd much better have stayed here." "Well, I don't want to know anyway," said Clare, taking a sudden interest in the candy. "I believe it is cold, Jasper. Let's look." "Polly," Alexia was saying in the library behind the portieres, "I know now, because I did it once myself. It was when you first promised you'd be a friend to me, and I went home, and cried for very joy, and I didn't want to see anybody that night." "Oh, Alexia!" exclaimed Polly, giving her a hug that satisfied even Alexia. "No, I didn't, and I remember how I wanted to hold something up to my face. I never thought of a sofa pillow, and I couldn't have gotten it if I had thought, 'cause Aunt had it crammed against her back. Oh, my eyes were a sight, Polly, and my nose was all over my face." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Five Little Peppers at School by Margaret Sidney. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23 The Clemcy Garden Party. "You may go on those errands, Hortense, but first send Polly Pepper to me," commanded Mrs. Chatterton sharply. The French maid paused in the act of hanging up a gown. "I will request her, madame. I should not like to send Miss Polly Pepper." "Miss Polly Pepper!" Mrs. Chatterton was guilty of stamping her foot. "Are you mad? I am speaking of Polly Pepper, this country girl, who is as poor and low born here in this house as if in her little brown house, wherever that may be." Hortense shrugged her shoulders and hung up the gown. "Has madame any further commands for me?" she asked, coming up to her mistress. "Yes, be sure to get the velvet at Lemaire's, and take back the silk kimono. I will send to New York for one." "Yes, madame." "That is all, besides the other errands. Now go." She dismissed her with a wave of her shapely hand. "But first, as I bade you, send Polly Pepper to me." Hortense, with another elevation of her shoulders, said nothing till she found herself the other side of the door. Then she shook her fist at it. "It is not Miss Polly who will be sent for, it is madame who will be sent out of this house. Je ai peur! Ha, ha, ha!" She laughed softly to herself all the way downstairs, with an insolent little fling to her head, that boded ill for her mistress's interests. Meanwhile Mrs. Chatterton was angrily pacing up and down the room. "What arrant nonsense a man can be capable of when he is headstrong to begin with! To think of the elegant Horatio King, a model for all men, surrounding himself with this commonplace family! Faugh! It is easy enough to see what they are all after, but I shall prevent it. Meanwhile, the only way to do it is to break the spirit of this Polly Pepper. Once do that, and I have the task easy to my hand." She listened intently. It can't be possible that she would refuse to come. Ha! I thought so. Polly came quietly in. No one to see her face would have supposed that she had thrown aside the book she had been waiting weeks to read, so that lessons in music need not suffer. For she was really glad when Mrs. Chatterton's French maid asked her respectfully if she would please be so good as to step up to her mistress's apartments. "S'il vous plaît, Miss Polly?" "Yes, indeed," cried Polly, springing off from the window seat, and forgetting the enchanted storyland immediately in the rush of delight. "Oh, I have another chance to try to please her," she thought, skimming over the stairs. But she was careful to restrain her steps on reaching the room. "You may take that paper," said Mrs. Chatterton, seating herself in her favourite chair, "and read to me. You know the things I desire to hear, or ought to." She pointed to the Society News, Town Talk, lying on the table. Polly took it up, glad to be of the least service, and whirled it over to the fashion items, feeling sure now that she was on the right road to favour. "Don't rattle it!" cried Mrs. Chatterton in a thin, high voice. "I'll try not to," said Polly, wishing she could be deft-handed like Mamsie, and doing her best to get to the inner page quietly. "And why don't you read where you are?" cried Mrs. Chatterton. "Begin on the first page. I wish to hear that first." Polly turned the sheet back again, and obeyed, but she hadn't read more than a paragraph when she came to a dead stop. "Go on," commanded Mrs. Chatterton, her eyes sparkling. She had forgotten to play with her rings, being perfectly absorbed in the delicious morsels of exceedingly unsavoury gossip she was hearing. Polly laid the paper in her lap, and her two hands fell upon it. "Oh, Mrs. Chatterton," she cried, the colour flying from her cheek, "please let me read something else to you. Mamsie wouldn't like me to read this." The brown eyes filled with tears, and she leaned forward imploringly. "Stuff and nonsense!" exclaimed Mrs. Chatterton passionately. "I command you to read that, girl. Do you hear me?" "I cannot," said Polly in a low voice. "Mamsie wouldn't like it." But it was perfectly distinct, and fell upon the angry ears clearly, and storm as she might, Mrs. Chatterton knew that the little country maiden would never bend to her will in this case. "I would have you know that I understand much better than your mother possibly can what is good for you to read. Besides, she will never know."
"Mamsie knows every single thing that we children do," cried Polly decidedly, and lifting her pale face, "and she understands better than any one else about what we ought to do, for she is our mother."
"What arrant nonsense!" exclaimed Mrs. Chatterton passionately, and unable to control herself at the prospect of losing Polly for a reader, which she couldn't endure, as she thoroughly enjoyed her services in that line. She got out of her chair and paced up and down the long apartment angrily, saying all sorts of most disagreeable things that Polly only half heard, so busy was she debating in her own mind what she ought to do. Should she run out of the room and leave this dreadful old woman that every one in the house was tired of? Surely she had tried enough to please her, but she could not do what Mamsie would never approve of. And just as Polly had decided to slip out, she looked up. Mrs. Chatterton, having exhausted her passion, as it seemed to do no good, was returning to her seat with such a dreary step and forlorn expression that she seemed 10 years older. She really looked very feeble, and Polly broke out impulsively,
"Oh, let me read the other part of the paper, dear Mrs. Chatterton. May I?"
"Read it," said Mrs. Chatterton ungraciously, and sat down in her favourite chair. Polly, scarcely believing her ears, whirled over the sheet, and determined to read as well as she possibly could, managed to throw so much enthusiasm into the fashion hints and social items, that presently Mrs. Chatterton's eyes were sparkling again, although she was deprived of her unsavoury morsels. And before long she was eagerly telling Polly to read over certain dictates of the Paris correspondent, who was laying down the law for feminine dress, and calling again for the last information of the movements of members of her social set, till there could be no question of her enjoyment. Polly, not knowing or caring how long she had been thus occupied, so long as Mrs. Chatterton was happy, was only conscious that Hortense came back from the errands, which occasioned only a brief pause. "Put the parcels down," said Mrs. Chatterton, scarcely glancing at her. "I cannot attend to you now. Go on, Polly." So Polly went on until the fashionable and social world had been so thoroughly canvassed that even Mrs. Chatterton was quite convinced that she could get no more from the paper. "You may go now," she said, but with a hungry glance for the first page. Then she tore her gaze away, and repeated more coldly than ever, "You may go." Polly ran off, dismayed to find how happy she was at the release. Her feet, unaccustomed to sitting still so long, were numb, and little prickles were running up and down her legs. She hurried as fast as she could into Mamsie's room, feeling in need of all the good cheer she could find.
"Mrs. Fisher has gone out," said Jane, going along the hall. "Gone out?" repeated Polly. "Oh, where? Do you know, Jane?" "I don't exactly know," said Jane, "but she took Miss Phronsie, and I think it's shopping they went for. Mr. King has taken them in the carriage." "Oh, I know it is," cried Polly, and a dreadful feeling surged through her. Why had she spent all this time with that horrible old woman, and lost this precious treat? "They thought you had gone to the Salisbury School," said Jane, wishing she could give some comfort, "for they wanted you awfully to go." "And now I've lost it all," cried Polly, at a white heat, "all this perfectly splendid time with Grandpapa and Mamsie and Phronsie, just for the sake of a horrible—" Then she broke short off, and ran back into Mamsie's room, and flung herself down by the bed, just as she used to do, by the four-poster in the bedroom of the little brown house. "Why, Polly, child!" Mrs. Fisher's voice was very cheery as she came in, Phronsie hurrying after. "I don't see her," began Phronsie in a puzzled way, and peering on all sides. "Where is she, Mamsie?" Mrs. Fisher went over and laid her hand on Polly's brown head. "Now, Phronsie, you may run out, that is a good girl." She leaned over and set a kiss on Phronsie's red lips. "Is Polly sick?" asked Phronsie, going off to the door obediently, but looking back with wondering eyes. "No, dear, I think not," said Mrs. Fisher. "Run along, dear." "I am so glad she isn't sick," said Phronsie as she went slowly off. Yet she carried a troubled face. "I ought to go and see how Sinbad is," she decided as she went downstairs. This visit was an everyday performance, to be carefully gone through with. So she passed out of the big side doorway to the veranda. "There is Michael now!" she cried joyfully, espying that individual raking up the west lawn. So skipping off, she flew over to him. This caught the attention of little Dick from the nursery window. "Hurry up there!
he cried crossly to Battles, who was having a hard time anyway getting him into a fresh sailor suit.
"Oh, Dickie, Dickie!" called Mamma softly from her room.
"I can't help it, Mamma. Battles is slow and poky," he fumed.
"Oh, no, dear," said his mother. "Battles always gets you ready very swiftly as well as nicely."
Battles, a comfortable person, turned her round face with a smile toward the door.
"And if you was more like your mamma, Master Dick, you'd be through with dressing and make everything more pleasant to yourself and to every one else."
"Well, I'm not in the least like Mamma, Battles. I can't be."
"No, indeed you ain't, but you can try," said Battles encouragingly.
"Why, Battles Whitney!" exclaimed Dick, whirling around on her.
In astonishment or any excitement, Dickie invariably gave her the whole name that he felt she ought to possess, Mrs. Mara Battles not being at all within his comprehension.
"What an awful story!"
"Dickie, Dickie!" reproved Mrs. Whitney.
"Well, I can't help it, Mamma."
Dick now escaped from Battles' hands altogether and fled into the other room, the comfortable person following.
"She said," plunging up to her chair in great excitement, "that I could be like you."
"I said you could try to be," corrected Battles, smoothing down her apron.
"And she knows I can't ever be, in all this world," declared Dick, shaking his short curls in decision, and glancing back to see the effect. "For you're a woman, and I'm always going to be a man. Why, see how big I am!"
He squared off and strutted up and down the little boudoir. "And you'd be bigger if you'd let me fix your blouse and button it up," declared Battles, laughing, and bearing down on him to fasten the band and tuck in the vest.
"And if you were more like your mother in disposition, that's what I mean, 'twould be a sight comfortabler for you and every one else. Now, says I, your hair's got to be brushed."
And she led him back into the nursery, laughing all the way.
"What makes you shake so when you laugh, Battles?" asked Dick suddenly, and ignoring all references to his disposition.
"Can't help it," said Battles, beginning to work on the curls. "That's because there's so much of me, I suppose," and she laughed more than ever.
"There's so very much of you, Battles," observed Dick with a critical look all over her rotund figure. "What makes it?"
"Oh, I don't know," said Battles. "Stand still, Dickie, and I'll be through all the sooner. Some folks is big and round, and some folks is little and scrawny."
"What's scrawny?"
asked Dick, who always got as many alleviations by conversation as possible out of the detested hair brushing.
"Why, thin and lean." "Oh, well, go on, Battles."
"And I'm one of the big and round ones," said Battles, seeing no occasion in that statement to abate her cheerfulness. So she laughed again.
"I like you big and round, Battles," cried little Dick affectionately, and whirling about so suddenly as to endanger his eye with the comb doing good execution.
And he essayed to put his arms around her waist, which he was always hoping to be able to accomplish. "That's good," said Battles, laughing, well pleased. "But you mustn't jump around so. There now, in a minute you shall be off," and she took up the brush.
"I must," declared Dick,
remembering his sight of Phronsie running across the lawn.
"Do hurry, Battles," he pleaded,
which so won her heart that she abridged part of the brushing and let him scamper off. Phronsie was kneeling down in front of Sinbad's kettle.
"Can't you untie him to-day, Michael?" she asked,
a question she had propounded each morning since the boys went back to school.
"Yes, Miss Phronsie, I think I can. He's wonted now, and the other dogs are accustomed to him. Besides, I've locked up Jerry since he fit him." "I know," said Phronsie sorrowfully. "That was naughty of Jerry when Sinbad had only just come."
Michael scratched his head. He couldn't tell her what was on his mind, that Sinbad was scarcely such a dog as anyone would buy, and therefore his presence was not to be relished by the high-bred animals already at home on the place.
"Well, you know, Miss Phronsie," he said at last, "it's kinder difficult like to expect some dogs to remember their manners, and Jerry ain't like all the others in that respect." "Please tell him about it," said Phronsie earnestly, "how good Prince is to Sinbad, and then I guess he'll want to be like him."
For Phronsie had never swerved in her allegiance to Prince ever since he had saved her from the naughty organ man in the little brown house days. And in all her conversations with the other dogs, she invariably held up Jasper's big black dog, his great friend and companion since pinafore days, as their model. And just then Dickie ran up breathlessly.
"Dick," announced Phronsie excitedly, "Michael is going to let Sinbad out to-day," and she clasped her hands in delight.
"Jolly!" exclaimed Dick, capering about.
"Now, Master Dick, you must let the dog alone," cried Michael. "It's time to try him with his freedom a bit. He's chafing at that chain." He looked anxiously at Dick.
Stand off there, both of you," and he slipped the chain off.
Sinbad gave a little wiggle with his hind legs and stretched his yellow body. It was too good to be true. But it was, though. He was free, and he shot out from his kennel, which was down in the gardener's quarters, and quite removed from the other dogs, and fairly tore, his ragged little tail straight out, across the west lawn. "Oh, he'll run back to Joel at school!" cried Dick, who hadn't heard Joel say he must be tied at first when everything was strange, and he started on a mad run after him. "You stay still," roared Michael. "That dog's only stretching his legs. He'll come back." But as well tell the north wind to stop blowing. Dickie's blouse puffed out with the breeze, as his small legs executed fine speed. "Oh, Michael!" cried Phronsie in the greatest distress. "Make Dickie come back." "Oh, he'll come back," said Michael reassuringly, though he quaked inwardly. And so Dickie did. But it was now a matter of Sinbad chasing him, for as Michael had said, the dog, after stretching his legs as the mad rush across the lawn enabled him to do, now was very much pleased to return for a little petting at the hands of those people who had given him every reason to expect that he should receive it, and supposing, from Dick's chase after him, that a race was agreeable, he set forth, his ears, as ragged as his tail, pricked up in the fullest enjoyment of the occasion. But Dick saw nothing in it to enjoy, and exerting all his strength to keep ahead, which he couldn't do as well for the reason that he was screaming fearfully, Sinbad came up with him easily. Dickie, turning his head in mad terror at that instant, stumbled and fell. Sinbad, unable to stop at short notice, or rather no notice at all, rolled over with him in a heap. This brought all the stable boys to the scene, besides Mrs. Whitney, who had seen some of the affair from her window, and finally, when everything was beginning to be calmed down, Battles reached the lawn. Sinbad was in Phronsie's lap, who sat on the grass holding him tightly. "Oh, Phronsie!" gasped Mrs. Whitney at that. "Michael, do take him away," as she fled by to Dick. One of the stable boys was brushing off the grime from his sailor suit. "The dog is all right, ma'am," said Michael. "'Twas only play. I suppose Master Joel has raced with him." "'Twas only play," repeated little Dick, who, now that he found himself whole, was surprised the idea hadn't occurred to him before. "Ho! I'm not hurt, and I'm going to race with him again." "Not to-day, Dickie," said Mrs. Whitney, looking him all over anxiously. "He's all right, ma'am," declared Michael. "They just rolled over together, 'cause you see, ma'am, the dog couldn't stop, he was a-goin' so fast, when the youngster turned right in his face." And Dick, to prove his soundness of body and restoration of mind, ran up to Phronsie, and flung himself down on the grass by her side. Sinbad received him as a most pleasant acquaintance, cocked up his ragged ears, and tried to wag his poor little scrubby tail, never quite getting it into his head that it wasn't long and graceful. And then he set upon the task of licking Dick's hands all over, and as much of his face as was possible to compass. "See that now!" cried Michael triumphantly, pointing. "That dog mayn't be handsome, but he ain't got a bad bone in his body if he does look like the evil one hisself." This episode absorbing all their attention, nobody heard or saw Alexia rise, running lightly up over the terrace. "Oh my, what are you doing? And where's Polly?" she asked of Mrs. Whitney. It being soon told, Alexia, who evidently had some exciting piece of news for Polly, ran into the house. "Polly!" she called. "Oh, Polly Pepper, where are you?" running over the stairs at the same time. But Polly, as we have seen, was not in her room. "Now then," Mother Fisher said, at sound of Alexia's voice, "as we've finished our talk, Polly, why, you must run down and see her." But Polly clung to her mother's neck. "Do you think I ought to go next Saturday morning out shopping, Mamsie, after I've been so naughty?" "Indeed you ought," cried Mrs. Fisher, in her most decisive fashion. "Dear me, that would be very dreadful, Polly, after we put it off for you, when we thought you had gone down to the Salisbury School. Why, we couldn't get along without you, Polly." So Polly, with a happy feeling at her heart that she was really needed to make the shopping trip a success, and best of all for the long talk with Mamsie that had set many things right, ran down to meet Alexia, brimming over with her important news. "Where have you been?" demanded Alexia, just on the point of rushing out of Polly's room in despair. "I've looked everywhere for you, even in the shoe box." And without waiting for a reply, she dragged Polly back. "Oh, you can't possibly guess!" her pale eyes gleaming with excitement. "Then tell me, do, Alexia," begged Polly, scarcely less wrought up. "Oh, Polly, the most elegant thing imaginable!"
Alexia dearly loved to spin out her exciting news as long as possible, driving the girls almost frantic by such methods.
"Well, if you are not going to tell me, I might as well go back again up in Mamsie's room," declared Polly, working herself free from the long arms, and starting for the door. "Oh, I'll tell, Polly, I'll tell!" cried Alexia, plunging after. "Miss Salisbury says I've just been up to the school after my German grammar that Mr. John Clemcy and Miss Ophelia have invited the whole Salisbury School out there for next Saturday afternoon. Think of it, after that smashed vase, Polly Pepper!"
Polly Pepper sat down on the shoe box, quite gone in surprise. It was as Alexia had said, a most surprising thing, when one took into consideration how much Mr. John Clemcy had suffered from the carelessness of a Salisbury pupil on the occasion of the accidental visit. But evidently one of his reasons, though by no means the only one, was his wish to solve the feelings of the gentlewomen, who were constantly endeavouring to show him their overwhelming sorrow, and trying to make all possible reparation for the loss of the vase. And he had stated his desire so forcibly on one of the many visits to the school that seemed to be necessary after the accident, that Miss Salisbury was unable to refuse the invitation, although it nearly threw her, self-contained as she usually was, into a panic at the very idea.
"But why did you promise, sister?" Miss Anstice turned on her on the withdrawal of the gentleman, whose English composure of face and bearing was now, in its victory, especially trying to bear. "I am surprised at you. Something dreadful will surely happen." "Don't, Anstice," begged Miss Salisbury, nervous to the last degree, since even the support of sister was to be withdrawn. "It was the least I could do, to please him, after what has happened." "Well, something will surely happen," mourned Miss Anstice. "You know how unfortunate it has been from the very beginning. I have never been able to look at that gown since, although it has been washed till every stain is removed." "Put it on for this visit, sister," advised Miss Salisbury, with a healthy disapproval of superstitions, "and break the charm." "Oh, never!" Miss Anstice raised her slender hands. "I wouldn't run such a chance as to wear that gown for all the world. It will be unlucky enough, you will see, without that, sister." But as far as anybody could see, everything was perfectly harmonious and successful on the following Saturday afternoon. To begin with, the weather was perfect, although at extremely short intervals Miss Anstice kept reminding her sister that a tremendous shower might be expected when the expedition was once under way. The girls, when they received their invitation Monday morning from Miss Salisbury in the long schoolroom, were, to state it figuratively, taken off their feet in surprise, with the exception of those fortunate enough to have caught snatches of the news always sure to travel fast when set going by Alexia; and wild was the rejoicing, when they could forget the broken vase, at the prospect of another expedition under Miss Salisbury's guidance. "If Miss Anstice only weren't going," sighed Clem. "She is such a fussy old thing, it spoils everybody's fun just to look at her." "Well, don't look at her," advised Alexia calmly. "For my part, I never do, unless I can't help it." "How are you going to help it?" cried Amy Garrett dismally, "when you are in her classes? Oh dear, I do wish Miss Salisbury would get rid of her as a teacher, and let Miss Wilcox take her place." "Miss Wilcox is just gay!" exclaimed Sylvia. "Well, don't let's talk of that old frump any more. Goodness me, here she comes!" as Miss Anstice advanced down the long hall, where the girls were discussing the wonderful invitation after school. And as the day was perfect, so the spirits of the Salisbury girls were at their highest, and Mr. Kimball and his associates drove them over in the same big barges, the veteran leader not recovering from the surprise into which he had been thrown by this afternoon party, given to the Salisbury School by Mr. Clemcy and his sister.
"Of all the things in this world, this is the cap sheaf," he muttered several times on the way. "A good 10 year or more those English folks have been drawing back in them pretty grounds, and offending every one, and now to get a passel of girls to run over and stomp 'em all down." Being unable to solve the puzzle, it afforded him plenty of occupation to work away at it. Mr. Clemcy and Miss Ophelia, caring as little for the opinion of the stage driver as for the rest of the world, received the visitors on the broad stone piazza, whose pillars ran the length of the house, and up to the roof, affording a wide gallery above. It was all entwined with English ivy and creepers taken from the homestead in Devonshire, and brought away when the death of the old mother made it impossible for life to be sustained by Miss Ophelia unless wrenched up from the roots where clustered so many memories. So brother John decided to make that wrench, and to make it complete. So here they were. I didn't know it was so pretty," cried Clem, after the ladies had been welcomed with the most gracious, old-time hospitality, and the schoolgirls tumbled out of the barges to throng up. "It rained so when we were here before, we couldn't see anything." "Pretty!" replied Alexia, comprehending it all in a swift, bird-like glance. "It's perfectly beautiful." She turned, and Mr. Clemcy, who was regarding her, smiled, and they struck up a friendship on the spot. "Miss Salisbury, allow me." Mr. Clemcy was leading her off. Miss Anstice, not trusting the ill-fated white gown, rustled after in the black silk one, with Miss Ophelia down the wide hall, open at the end, with vistas of broad fields beyond, where the host paused. "Let the young ladies come," he said, and the girls trooped after, to crowd around the elder people. Amongst the palms and bookcases with which the broad hall was lined was a pedestal whose top was half covered with a soft filmy cloth. Mr. Clemcy lifted this and took it off carefully. There stood the little vase, presenting as brave an appearance as in its first perfection. Miss Salisbury uttered no exclamation, but preserved her composure by a violent effort. "I flatter myself on my ability to repair my broken collection," began Mr. Clemcy, when a loud exclamation from the girls in front startled every one. Miss Anstice, on the first shock, had been unable to find that composure that was always sister's envied possession, so despite the environment of the black silk gown, she gave it up, and sank gradually to the ground. "I told you so!" cried Clem in a hoarse whisper to her nearest neighbours. "She always spoils everybody's fun." As Miss Anstice, at the host's suggestion, his sister being rendered incapable of action at this sudden emergency, was put to rest in one of the pretty chintz-covered rooms above, till such time as she could recover herself enough to join them below. "I couldn't help it, sister," she said. "I've been so worried about that vase. You don't know, because you're always so calm, and then to see it standing there, it quite took away my breath." Oh, the delights of the rose garden, in which every variety of the old-fashioned rose seemed to have a place lovingly assigned to it! Sweetbrier clambered over the walls of the gardener's cottage, the stables, and charming summer houses into which the girls ran with delight, for Mr. Clemcy had said they were to go everywhere and enjoy everything without restraint. "He's a dear!" exclaimed Lucy Bennett, "only I'm mortally afraid of him." "Well, I'm not," proclaimed Alexia. The idea of Alexia being in any state that would suggest fear, being so funny, the girls burst out laughing. "Well, we shan't any of us feel like laughing much in a little while," said Clem dolefully. "What is the matter?" cried a dozen voices. "Matter enough," replied Clem. "I've said so before, and now I know it's coming. Just look at that." She pushed aside the swaying branches of the sweetbrier, and pointed tragically. "I don't see anything," said one or two of the girls. "There!" "There" meant Mr. Clemcy and Miss Salisbury passing down the rose walk, the broad central path. He was evidently showing her some treasured variety, and descanting on it, the principal of the Salisbury school, from her wide knowledge of roses, as well as other subjects, being able to respond very intelligently. "Oh, can't you see, you stupid things!" cried Clem. "He's going to marry our Miss Salisbury, and then she'll give up our school, and she turned away and threw herself off in a corner. A whole chorus of "No, no!" burst upon this speech. "Hush!" cried Alexia, quite horrified. "Polly, do stop them. Miss Salisbury is turning around, and she's been worried quite enough over that dreadful Miss Anstice," which had the effect of reducing the girls to do quiet. "But it isn't so," cried the girls in frantic whispers. "What Clem says," and those who were not sure of themselves huddled down on the summer-house floor. "Say, Alexia, you don't think so, do you?" But Alexia would give them no comfort, but wisely seizing Polly's arm, departed with her. "I shall say something I'll be sorry for," she declared, "if I stay another moment longer. For Polly Pepper, I really do believe it's true what Clem says." And the rest of that beautiful afternoon, with rambles over the wide estate, and tea with berries and cream on the terraces, was a dream, scarcely comprehended by the Salisbury girls, who were strangely quiet and well behaved. For this Miss Salisbury was thankful. And presently Miss Anstice, coming down in the wake of Miss Ophelia, was put carefully into a comfortable chair on the stone veranda, where she sat pale and quiet, Miss Clemcy assiduously devoting herself to her, and drawing up a little table to her side for berries and cream and tea. "Now we will be comfortable together," said Miss Ophelia, the maid bringing her special little pot of tea. "I am so mortified, my dear Miss Clemcy," began Miss Anstice, her little hands nervously working, "to have given away—" all of which she had said over and over to her hostess in the chintz-covered room, "and you were so kind to overlook it so beautifully." "It is impossible to blame one of your delicate sensibility," said Miss Ophelia, with her healthy English composure, quiet in her element to have some one to fuss over, and to make comfortable in her own way. "Now then, I trust that tea is quite right," handing her a cup. Chapter 24 of Five Little Peppers at School by Margaret Sidney. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 14 The Piece of News. "Pepper, you're wanted!" Dick Furness banged into Joel's room, then out again, adding 2 words, "Harrow, immediately!" "All right," said Joel, whistling on, all his thoughts upon Moose Island and the expedition there on the morrow. And he ran lightly down to the second floor, and into the under teacher's room. Mr. Harrow was waiting for him, and pushing aside some books, for he never seemed to be quite free from them even for a moment, he motioned Joel to a seat. Joel, whose pulses were throbbing with the liveliest expectations, didn't bother his head with what otherwise might have struck him as somewhat queer in the under teacher's manner. For the thing in hand was what Joel principally gave himself to. And as that clearly could be nothing else than the Moose Island expedition, it naturally followed that Mr. Harrow had to speak twice before he could gain his attention. But when it was gained, there was not the slightest possible chance of misunderstanding what the under teacher was saying, for it was the habit of this instructor to come directly to the point without unnecessary circumlocution. But his voice and manner were not without a touch of sadness on this occasion that softened the speech itself. "Joel, my boy," Mr. Harrow began, "you know I have often had you down here to urge on those lessons of yours." "Yes, sir," said Joel, wondering now at the voice and manner. "Well, now, to-day I am instructed by the master to send you for a different reason. Can you not guess?" "No, sir," said Joel, comfortable in the way things had been going on, and wholly unable to imagine the blow about to fall. "I wish you had guessed it, Joel," said Mr. Harrow, moving uneasily in his chair, "for then you would have made my task easier. Joel, Dr. Marks says, on account of your falling behind in your lessons, without reason, understand this, Joel, without reason, you are not to go to Moose Island tomorrow." Even then Joel did not comprehend. So Mr. Harrow repeated it distinctly. "What?" roared Joel. In his excitement he cleared the space between them, and gained Mr. Harrow's side. "Not go to Moose Island, Mr. Harrow!" his black eyes widening, and his face working fearfully. "No," said Mr. Harrow, drawing a long breath. "You are not to go, so Dr. Marks says." "But I must go!" cried Joel, quite gone in a passion. "Must is a singular word to use here, Joel," observed Mr. Harrow sternly. "But oh, Mr. Harrow, do see if you can't help me to go." Joel squirmed all over, and even clutched the under teacher's arm piteously. "Alas, Joel, it is beyond my power." Mr. Harrow shook his head. He didn't think it necessary to state that he had already used every argument he could employ to induce Dr. Marks to change his mind. Some strong pressure must be brought to bear upon Pepper, or he will amount to nothing but an athletic lad. He must see the value of study, the master had responded, and signified that the interview was ended, and his command was to be carried out. "Joel," Mr. Harrow was speaking, "be a man, and bear this as you can. You've had your chances for study, and not taken them. It is a case of must now. Remember, Dr. Marks is doing this in love to you. He has got to fit you out as well as he can in this school to take that place in life that your mother wants you to fill. Don't waste a moment on vain regrets, but buckle to your studies now." It was a long speech for the under teacher, and he had a hard time getting through with it. At its end, Joel, half dazed with his misfortune, but with a feeling that as a man Dr. Marks and Mr. Harrow had treated him, hurried back to his room, dragged his chair up to the table, and pushing off the untidy collection of rackets, tennis balls, boxing gloves, and other implements of his gymnasium work in his recreation hours, lent his whole heart with a new impulse to his task. Somehow he did not feel like crying, as had often been the case with previous trials. "He said, 'Be a man,'" Joel kept repeating over and over to himself, while the words of his lesson swam before his eyes. "And so I will. And he said, 'Dr. Marks has got to make me as Mamsie wanted me to be,'" repeated Joel to himself, taking a shorter cut with the idea. "And so I will be. and he leaned his elbows on the table, bent his head over his book, and clutching his stubby crop by both hands and holding on tightly, he was soon lost to his misfortune and the outside world. "Hullo!" David stood still in amazement at Joel's unusual attitude over his lesson. Then he reflected that he was making up extra work to be free for the holiday on the morrow. Notwithstanding the need of quiet, David was so full of it that he couldn't refrain from saying jubilantly, "Oh, what a great time we'll have tomorrow, Joe!" giving him a pound on the back. "I'm not going," said Joel, without raising his head. David ran around his chair to look at him from the further side, then peered under the bunch of curls Joel was hanging to. "What's the matter, Joe?" he gasped, clutching the table. "Dr. Marks says I'm not to go," said Joel, telling the whole at once. "Dr. Marks said you were not to go?" repeated David. "Why, Joel, why?" he demanded in a gasp. "I haven't studied. I'm way behind. Let me alone," cried Joel. "I've got a perfect lot to make up," and he clutched harder than ever at his hair. "Then I shall not go," declared David, and rushing out of the room he was gone before Joel could fly from his chair, which he did, upsetting it after him. "Dave! Dave!" he yelled, running out into the hall, in the face of a stream of boys coming up from gymnasium practice. "What's up, Pepper?" But he went through their ranks like a shot. Nevertheless, David was nowhere to be seen, as he had taken some short cut and was lost in the crowd. Joel bent his steps to the under-teacher's room, knocked, and in his excitement thought he heard, "Come in." And with small ceremony he precipitated himself upon Mr. Harrow, who seemed to be lost in a reverie, his back to him, leaning his elbow on the mantel, and his head upon his hand. Oh!" exclaimed Mr. Harrow, startled out of his usual composure, and turning quickly to face Joel. "Oh, it's you, Pepper," which by no means lifted him out of his depression. "Dave says he won't go without me. You must make him," said Joel, in his intensity forgetting his manners. "To Moose Island?" asked Mr. Harrow. Joel nodded. He couldn't yet bring himself to speak the name. "All right, I will, Joe." Mr. Harrow grasped the brown hand hanging by Joel's side. "Really?" said Joel, swallowing hard. "Really. Run back to your books, and trust me." So Joel dashed back, not minding the alluring cries from several chums. "Come on, just time for a game before supper," and was back before his table in the same attitude, and hanging to his hair. "I can study better so," he said, and holding on for dear life. One or two boys glanced in. "Come out of this hole," they cried. "No need to study for tomorrow. Gee whiz, just think of Moose Island, Joe." No answer. "Joe!" They ran in and shook his shoulders. "Moose Island!" they screamed, and the excitement with which the whole school was charged was echoing it through the length of the dormitory. "Go away!" cried Joel at them, "or I'll fire something at you," as they swarmed around his chair. "Fire your old grammar," suggested one, trying to twitch away his book, and another pulled the chair out from under him. Joel sprawled a moment on the floor, then he sprang up, hanging to his book, and faced them. "I'm not going. Clear out!" And in a moment the room was as still as if an invasion had never taken place. In their astonishment they forgot to utter a word. And in 10 minutes the news was all over the playground and in all the corridors. "Joe Pepper isn't going to Moose Island." If they had said that the cornerstone of the dormitory was shaky, the amazement would not have been so great in some quarters, and the story was not believed until they had it from Joe himself. Then amazement changed to grief. Not to have Joe Pepper along was to do away with half the fun. Percy ran up to him in the greatest excitement just before supper. "What is it, Joe?" he cried. "The fellows are trying to say that you're not going to Moose Island." He was red with running, and panted dreadfully. "And Van is giving it to Red Hiller for telling such a whopper." "Well, he needn't," said Joel, "for it's perfectly true. I'm not going." Percy tried to speak, but what with running and his astonishment, his tongue flapped up idly against the roof of his mouth. "Dr. Marks won't let me," said Joel, not mincing matters. "I've got to study, so there's an end of it." But when Davy came in, a woebegone figure, for Mr. Harrow had kept his promise, then was Joel's hardest time. And he clenched his brown hands to keep the tears back then, for David gave way to such a flood in the bitterness of his grief to go without Joel, that for a time Joel was in danger of utterly losing his own self-control. "I'm confounded glad." It was Jenk who said it, to his small following, and hearing it, Tom Beresford blazed at him. "If you weren't quite so small, I'd knock you down." "Well, I am glad." Jenk put a goodly distance between himself and Tom, notwithstanding Tom's disgust at the idea of touching him. "For Pepper is so high and mighty, it's time he was taken down." But a chorus of yells made him beat a retreat. Dr. Marks paced up and down his study floor, his head bent, his hands folded behind him. It was the only way. No ordinary course could be taken with Pepper. It had come to be imperative. It will make a man of him. He stepped to the desk and wrote a few words, slipped them into an envelope, sealed and addressed it. Joanna! He went to the door and summoned a maid, the same one who had shaken her broom at Joel when he rushed in with a dog. Take this over to the north dormitory as quickly as possible. It seemed to be especially necessary that haste be observed, and then Dr. Marks, usually so collected, hurried to the window to assure himself that his command was obeyed. Mrs. Fox took the note as Joanna handed it in, and sent it up at once, as those were the orders from the master. It arrived just at the moment when Joel was at the end of his self-mastery. He tore it open. My boy, knowing you as I do, I feel sure that you will be brave in bearing this. It will help you to conquer your dislike for study and make a man of you. Affectionately yours, H. L. Marks. Joel swung the note up over his head, and there was such a glad ring to his voice that David was too astonished to cry. See there! Joel proudly shook it at him. Read it, Dave! So David seized it and blinked in amazement. Dr. Marks has written to me, said Joel importantly, just as if David hadn't the note before him. And he says be a man, just as Mr. Harrow said, and affectionately yours. Now what do you think of that, Davy Pepper?
David was so lost in the honor that had come to Joel that the grief he was feeling in the thought of the expedition to be made to Moose Island tomorrow without Joel began to pale. He smiled and lifted his eyes, lately so wet with tears. Mamsie would like that note, Joe. Tom Beresford rushed in without the formality of a knock, and gloomily threw himself on the bed. Poor Joe, was written all over his long face. Oh, you needn't, Tom, said Joel gaily, and prancing up and down the room. Pity me, because I won't have it. It's pity for myself as well, said Tom lugubriously, and cramming the pillow end into his mouth. What's a fellow to do without you, Joe? Suddenly shying the pillow at Joel. Joe caught it and shied it back, then twitched the master's note out of David's hand. Read it, Tom, he cried with sparkling eyes. I'd much rather stay back with you, Joe, Tom was saying. Well, you won't, retorted Joel. Dave tried that on, but it was no good. Read it, I tell you. So Tom sat up on the bed and spread Dr. Marks' note on his knee. Great Caesar's ghost! It's from the master himself! And what does he say? Tom rubbed his eyes violently, stared, and rushed over the few sentences pell-mell, then returned to take them slowly to be sure of their meaning. Joe Pepper! He got off from the bed. Isn't it great? Cried Joel. Give me my note, Tom. I should say so, cried Tom, bobbing his head. I shouldn't in the least mind being kept back from a few things to get a note like that. Think of it, Joe, from Dr. Marks. I know it, cried Joel in huge satisfaction. Well, now you must take yourself off, Tom. I've got to study like a Trojan. He ran to the closet and came back with his arms full of books. All right, said Tom, shooting out. Then he shot back, giving Joel a pat, by no means a light one. Success to you, old fellow, and was off, this time for good. And Davy dreamed that night that Joel took first prize in everything straight through, and that he himself was sailing over an interminable sea, going to Moose Island probably, under a ban never to come back to Dr. Marks' school. And the first thing he knew, Joel was pounding him and calling lustily, Get up, Dave, you know you're to start early. And then all was bustle and confusion enough, as how could it be helped with all those boys getting off on such an expedition? And Joel was the brightest of them all, here, there, and everywhere. You never would have guessed that he wasn't the leading spirit in the whole expedition, and its bright particular star. And he ran down to the big stone gate to see them off. And the boys wondered, but there was no chance to pity him with such a face. There was only pity for themselves. And somebody started, 3 cheers for Joe Pepper! It wasn't the under-teacher, but he joined with a right good will, and the whole crowd took it up as Joel ran back to tackle his books, pinching Dr. Marks' letter in his pocket to make sure it really was there. Just about this time Alexia Rhys was rushing to school. She was late, for everything had gone wrong that morning from the very beginning. And of course Polly Pepper had started for school when Alexia called for her, and feeling as if nothing mattered now, the corner was reached despairingly when she heard her name called. It was an old lady who was a friend of her aunt's, and Alexia paused involuntarily, then ran across the street to see what she wanted. "Oh, my dear, I suppose I ought not to stop you, for you are going to school." "Oh, it doesn't matter," said Alexia indifferently. "I'm late anyway. What is it, Miss Seymour?" "I want to congratulate you. I must congratulate you," exclaimed old Miss Seymour, with an excited little cackle. "I really must, Alexia." Alexia ran over in her mind everything for which she could, by any possibility, be congratulated. Then she said, "What for?" quite abruptly. "Oh, my dear, haven't you heard?" Old Miss Seymour put her jeweled fingers on the girl's shoulder. She had gathered up her dressy morning robe in her hand, and hastened down her front steps at the first glimpse of Alexia across the way. Alexia knew of old the roundabout way pursued by her aunt's friend in her narrations. Besides, she cared very little anyway for this bit of old women's gossip. So she said carelessly, "No, I'm sure I haven't, and I don't believe it's much anyway, Miss Seymour." "Much anyway? Oh, my dear!" Old Miss Seymour held up both hands. "Well, what would you say if you should be told that your teacher was going to be married?" Alexia staggered backward and put up both hands. "Oh, don't, Miss Seymour!" she cried, the fears she had been lighting so many weeks now come true. Then she burst out passionately, "Oh, it isn't true! It can't be!" "Well, but it is," cried Miss Seymour positively. "I had it not 10 minutes since, from a very intimate friend, and as you were the first Salisbury girl I saw, why, I wanted to congratulate you, of course, as soon as I could." "Salisbury girl!" Alexia groaned, as she thought how they could never have that title applied to them any more, for of course the beautiful school was doomed. "And where shall we all go?" she cried to herself in despair. "Oh, how could she go and get engaged?" she exclaimed aloud. "You haven't asked who the man is," said Miss Seymour in surprise. "Oh, I know," said Alexia miserably. "It's Mr. John Clemcy. Oh, if we hadn't had that old picnic!" she burst out. "Eh, what?" exclaimed the little old lady quickly. "Never mind, it doesn't signify who the man is. It doesn't signify about anything," said Alexia wildly, "as long as Miss Salisbury is going to get married and give up our school." "Oh, I don't suppose the school will be given up," said Miss Seymour. "What? Why, of course it will be. How can she keep it after she's married?" cried Alexia impatiently. She longed to say, "You goose, you." "Why, I suppose the other one will keep it, of course, and it will go on just the same as it did before." "Oh, dear me! The idea of Miss Anstice keeping that school!" With all her misery, Alexia couldn't help bursting into a laugh. "Miss Anstice?" "Yes, if you knew her as we girls do, Miss Seymour, you'd never say she could run that school." "I never said she could." "Oh, yes, you did." Alexia was guilty of contradicting. "You said distinctly that when Miss Salisbury was married, you supposed Miss Anstice would keep it on just the same." Little old Miss Seymour took 3 or 4 steps down the pavement, then turned and trotted back, the dressy morning robe still gathered in her hand. "Who do you think is engaged to Mr. John Clemcy?" she asked, looking up at the tall girl. "Why, our Miss Salisbury," answered Alexia, ready to cry. "I suppose that's what you said." "Oh, no, I didn't," said the little old lady. "It's Miss Anstice Salisbury." Alexia gave her one look, then took some flying steps across the street, and away down to the Salisbury School. She met a stream of girls in the front hall, and as soon as she saw their faces, she knew that her news was all old. And they could tell her something more. "Miss Wilcox is going to be the assistant teacher," cried Amy Garrett. "And Miss Salisbury announced it. Why were you late, Alexia?" It was a perfect buzz around her ears. "And then she dismissed school, and we're all going down to the drawing room now to congratulate Miss Anstice." Alexia worked her way to Polly Pepper and clung to her. "Oh, Alexia, you've got here," cried Polly delightedly. "And only think, we can keep our Miss Salisbury after all." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of 5 Little Peppers at School by Margaret Sidney. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25 The Very Prettiest Affair. And Mr. John Clemcy, having put off any inclination to marry till so late in life, was, now that he had made his choice, in a ferment to hurry its consummation. And Miss Ophelia, who was still to keep the house and run the old-fashioned flower garden to suit herself, thus losing none of her honours, and being in her element, as has been stated, with some one to fuss over, her self-contained brother not yielding her sufficient occupation in that line, begged that the wedding might take place soon. So there was really no reason on earth why it should not be celebrated, and Miss Wilcox be installed as assistant.
and thus all things be in running order for the new year at the Salisbury School.
"And they say he has heaps of money, Mr. Clemcy has," cried Alexia, in the midst of the excitement of the next few days, when everybody was trying to adjust themselves to this new condition of affairs. A lot of the girls were up in Polly Pepper's room. "And it's an awful old family back of him in England," she went on, "though for my part I'd rather have something to do with making my name myself." "Oh, Alexia," cried Clem, "think of all those perfectly elegant old family portraits." "Mouldy old things!" exclaimed Alexia, who had small reverence for such things. "I should be ashamed of them if I were Mr. John Clemcy and his sister. They don't look as if they knew anything to begin with, and such arms and hands, and impossible necks. Oh my, it gives me quite a turn to look at them." "We are quite distinguished, the Salisbury School is," said Silvia, with an elegant manner and a toss of her head. "My mother says it will be splendid capital to Miss Salisbury to have such a connection." "And oh, just think of Miss Anstice's engagement ring!" exclaimed another girl. "Oh my, on her thin little finger!" "It's awful old fashioned," cried Silvia, "set in silver. But then it's big, and a very pure stone, my mother says, and quite shows that the family must have been something, for it is an heirloom." "Oh, do stop about family and heirlooms," cried Alexia impatiently. "The main thing is that our Miss Salisbury isn't going to desert us." "Miss Anstice is. Oh, goody!" Amy Garrett hopped up and down and softly beat her hands while she finished the sentence. "Hush!" Alexia turned on her suddenly. "Now, Amy and the rest of you girls, I think we ought to stop this nonsense about Miss Anstice. She's going, and I, maybe, haven't treated her just rightly." "Of course you haven't," assented Clem coolly. "You've worried her life nearly out of her." "And oh dear me, I'm sorry now," said Alexia, not minding in the least what Clem was saying. "I wonder why it is that I'm forever being sorry about things." "Because you're forever having your own way," said Clem. "I'll tell you." "And so I'm going to be nice to her now," said Alexia, with a perfectly composed glance at Clem. "Let's all be, girls, I mean behind her back." Polly Pepper ran over across the room to slip her arm within Alexia's and give her a little approving pat. "It will be so strange not to make fun of her," observed Amy Garrett, "but I suppose we can't now anyway, that she is to be Mrs. John Clemcy." "Mrs. John Clemcy, indeed!" exclaimed Alexia, standing very tall. "She was just as nice before as sister of our Miss Salisbury, I'd have you to know, girls." "Well, now what are we going to give her as a wedding present?" said Polly Pepper. "You know we, as the committee, ought to talk it over at once. Let's sit down on the floor in a ring and begin." "Yes," said Alexia, "now I'll flop," and setting the example she got down on the floor, and the girls tumbling after, the ring was soon formed. "Hush now, do be quiet, Clem, if you can," cried Alexia, to pay up old scores. "I guess I'm not making as much noise as some people," said Clem, with a wry face. "Well, Polly's going to begin, and she's chairman. We've all got to be still as mice. Hush!" "I think," said Polly, "the best way would be, instead of wasting so much time in talking and—" "Getting into a hubbub," interpolated Alexia. "Who's talking now?" cried Clem triumphantly, "and making a noise?" "Getting in confusion," finished Polly, "would be for each of us to write out the things that Miss Anstice might like, on a piece of paper, without showing it to any of the other girls, then pass them to me, and I'll read them aloud. And perhaps we'll choose something out of all the lists." "Oh, Polly, how fine! Just the thing!" "I'll get the paper." "And the pencils." The ring was in a hubbub, Alexia, as usual, the first to hop out of her place. "Sit down, girls," said Polly, as chairman, so they all flew back again. "There, you see now," said Alexia, huddling expeditiously into her place next to Polly, "how no one can stir till the chairman tells us to." "Who jumped first of all?" exclaimed Clem, bursting into a laugh. "Well, I'm back again now, anyhow," said Alexia coolly, and folding her hands in her lap. "I'll appoint Lucy Bennett and Sylvia Horne to get the paper and pencils," said Polly. "They are on my desk, girls." Alexia smothered the sigh at her failure to be one of the girls to perform this delightful task, but the paper being brought, she soon forgot her disappointment in having something to do. "We must all tear it up into strips," said the chairman, and beginning on a sheet, "Lucy, you can begin giving around the pencils." And presently the whole committee was racking its brains over this terribly important question thrust upon them. "It must be something that will always reflect credit on the Salisbury School," observed Alexia, leaning her chin on her hand while she played with her pencil. "Ugh, do be still!" Lucy, on the other side, nudged her. "I can't think, if anybody speaks a word."
"And fit in well with those old portraits," said Clem, with a look at Alexia. "Well, I hope and pray that we won't give her anything old. I want it spick span new and be absolutely up to date." Alexia took her chin out of her hand and sat up decidedly. "The idea of matching up those mouldy old portraits, and that house just bursting with antiques." "Ugh, do hush!" cried the girls. "And write what you want to, Alexia, on your own slip, and keep still," said Sylvia, wrinkling her brows. "You just put something out of my head, and it was perfectly splendid." "But I can't think of a thing that would be good enough," grumbled Alexia, "for the Salisbury School to give. Oh dear me!" and she regarded enviously the other pencils scribbling away. "My list is done." Amy Garrett pinched hers into a little three-cornered note and threw it into Polly's lap. "And mine, and mine!" They all came in fast, in a small white shower. "Oh my goodness!" exclaimed Alexia, much alarmed that she would be left out altogether. "Wait, Polly!" and she began scribbling away for dear life. "Oh dear me!" The chairman unfolded the first strip and began to read. "A piano! Why, girls, Miss Anstice can't play." "Well, it would look nice in that great big drawing room," said Clem, letting herself out with a very red face. "Oh my, you wrote a piano!" Alexia went over backwards suddenly to lie flat on the door and laugh. "Besides, there is one in that house." "An old thing!" exclaimed Clem in disdain. "Well, let's see, here's something nice." Polly ran along the list. "A handsome chair, a desk, a cabinet. Those are fine." "Clem has gone into the furniture business, I should think," said Philena. "And a cabinet!" exclaimed Amy Garrett, "when that house is just full of them." "Oh, I mean a jewel cabinet, or something of that sort," explained Clem hastily. "That's not bad," announced Sylvia, "for I suppose he'll give her all the rest of those heirlooms, great strings of pearls, probably he's got, and everything else. Dear me, don't I wish we girls could see them!" and she lost herself in admiration over the fabulous Clemcy jewels. "Wait, Polly, I mean." Alexia flew into position. "What's the next list?" "This is quite different," said Polly, unrolling it. "Some handsome lace, a fan, a lorgnette, a bracelet." "It's easy enough to see that's Sylvia's," said Alexia. "All that finery and furbelows." "Well, it's not fair to tell what you think and guess," said Sylvia, a pink spot coming on either cheek. "'Twouldn't make any difference, my guessing. We all know it's yours, Sylvia," said Alexia, coolly. "Well, I think that's a lovely list," said Amy with sparkling eyes, "and I for one would be willing to vote for any of those things." "My mother says we'd better give her something to wear," said Sylvia, smoothing down her gown. "Miss Anstice likes nice things, and that great big house is running over with everything to furnish with." Polly was reading the third list, so somebody pulled Alexia's arm and stopped her. "A watch and a chain, that's all there is on this list," announced Polly. "Oh!" there was a chorus of voices. "That's it, that's it!" and "Why didn't I think of that?" until the whole ring was in a tumult again. It was no matter what was on the other lists. The chairman read them over faithfully, but the items fell on dull ears. They might make suitable tributes for other brides. There was but one mind about the present for this particular bride going forth from the Salisbury School. The watch and chain was the only gift to be thought of. "And she wears that great big old-fashioned thing," declared Sylvia. "Looks like a turnip. Oh, oh!" "And I do believe that's always made her so impressive and scary whenever she got into that black silk gown," said Amy Garrett. "I never thought of it before, but it was that horrible old watch and chain." "Girls," said the chairman, "I do really believe that it would be the very best thing we could possibly give her. And now I'm going to tell who it was who chose it." "Do, oh do!" The whole ring came together in a bunch, as the girls crowded around Polly. "Alexia!" Then Polly turned and gave a loving little pat on the long back. "Don't," said Alexia, shrinking away from the shower of congratulations on having made the best choice, and thought of the very thing that was likely to unite the whole school on a gift. "It's nothing. I couldn't help but write it. It was the only thing I thought of." "Well, it was just as clever in you as could be, so there now!" Clem nodded over at her, and buried all animosity at once. "And think how nice it will be when it's all engraved inside the case with what we want to say," said Polly, with shining eyes. "And a great big monogram outside," said Sylvia, with enthusiasm, "and one of those twisted chains. Oh, how fine!" She shook out her silver bracelets till they jingled all her enthusiasm, and the entire committee joining, the vote was taken to propose the rest of the Salisbury girls, on the morrow, the gift of a watch and chain to the future Mrs. John Clemcy.
And the watch and chain was unanimously chosen by the Salisbury girls as the gift of all gifts they wanted to bestow upon their teacher on her wedding day. And they all insisted that Polly Pepper should write the inscription, so there it was, engraved beautifully on the inner side of the case, Anstice Salisbury, with the loving regard of her pupils. And there was a beautiful big monogram on the outside, and the long chain was double and twisted, and so handsome that Sylvia's mother protested she hadn't a word to say but the very highest praise. Oh, and the presentation of it came about quite differently from what was expected, after all. For the gift was to be sent with a little note, representing the whole school, and written, as was quite proper, by Polly Pepper, the chairman of the committee. But Miss Salisbury, to whom the precious parcel had been entrusted, said suddenly, "Why don't you give it to her yourselves, girls?" It was, of course, the place of the chairman of the committee to speak. So Polly said, "Oh, would she like to have us, Miss Salisbury?" "Yes, my dears, I know she would. She feels badly to go and leave you all, you know," and there were tears in the blue eyes that always looked so kindly on them. "And it would be a very lovely thing for you to do if you would like to." "We should love to do it," cried Polly warmly. "May we go now, dear Miss Salisbury?" "Yes," said Miss Salisbury, very much pleased. "She's in the red parlour." So the committee filed into the red parlour. There sat Miss Anstice and, oh dear me, Mr. John Clemcy! There was no time to retreat, for Miss Salisbury, not having heard Mr. Clemcy come in, was at the rear of the procession of girls. "Here, my dears, Anstice, the girls particularly want to see you. Oh!" And then she saw Mr. John Clemcy. Miss Anstice, who seemed to have dropped all her nervousness lately, saved the situation by coming forward and greeting them warmly, and when Mr. John Clemcy saw how it was, he went gallantly to the rescue, and was so easy and genial, and matter of course, that the committee presently felt as if a good part of their lives had been passed in making presentations, and that they were quite up to that sort of thing. And Polly made a neat little speech as she handed their packet, and Miss Anstice's eyes filled with tears of genuine regret at leaving them, and of delight at the gift. Girls, do you know, could it be Miss Anstice who was talking with so much feeling in her voice? "I used to imagine that you didn't love me." "Oh, that could never be!" cried Mr. Clemcy. "And I got so worried and cross over it. But now I know you did, and that I was simply tired, for I never could teach like sister." She cast her a loving glance. "And I didn't really love my work. And do you know, the thing I've longed for all my life was a watch and chain like this. Oh, girls, I should love it always." She threw the chain around her neck and laid the little watch gently against her cheek. "Oh!" It was Alexia who pressed forward. "You'll forgive us all, won't you, Miss Anstice, if we didn't love you enough?" "When I want to forgive, I'll look at my dear watch," said Miss Anstice brightly, and smiling on them all. "'Twas that horrible old black silk gown that made her so," exclaimed Alexia, as they all tumbled off down the hall in the greatest excitement. "You see how sweet she is now in that white one." "And the red rose in her belt," said Clem. "And her diamond ring," added Sylvia. "And we're different too," said Clem. "Maybe we wouldn't love to teach a lot of girls any better either, if we had to." "Well, and now there's the wedding!" exclaimed Amy Garrett, clasping her hands. "Oh!" "What richness!" finished Alexia. And everybody said it was "the very prettiest affair, and so picturesque." And those dear Salisbury girls, how sweet they looked, to be sure! Why, St. John's blossomed out like a veritable garden, just with that blooming company of girls, to say nothing of the exquisite flowers, and ropes of laurel and palms, and the broad white satin ribbons to divide the favored ones from the mere acquaintances. And what a lovely thought to get those boys from the Pemberton School for ushers, with Jasper King as their leader! They all made such a bright, youthful picture, to be followed by the chosen 8 of the Salisbury girls, the very committee who presented the gift to the bride-elect. There they were in their simple white gowns and big white hats. And then came the little assistant teacher of the Salisbury School, in her pearl gray robe, singularly enough, not half so much embarrassed as she had often been in walking down the long schoolroom before the girls. And Mr. John Clemcy never thought of such a thing as embarrassment at all, but stood up in his straightforward, manly, English composure to take his vows that bound him to the little school teacher. And Miss Salisbury, fairly resplendent in her black velvet gown, had down deep within her heart a childlike satisfaction in it all. Dear Anstice was happy, and somehow the outlook for the future, with Miss Wilcox for assistant teacher, was restful for one whose heart and soul were bound up in her pupils' advancement.
Miss Ophelia Clemcy blossomed out from her retirement, and became quite voluble in the front pew before the wedding procession arrived. "You see, it was foreordained to be," she announced, as she had before declared several times to the principal of the Salisbury School. "The first moment he saw her, Brother John was fully convinced that here was a creature of the greatest sensibility, and altogether charming. And, my dear Miss Salisbury, I am only commonplace and practical, you know, so it is all as it should be, and suits me perfectly. And we will always keep the anniversary of that picnic, that blessed day, won't we?" And old Mr. King invited the 8 ushers from the Pemberton School and the committee from the Salisbury School to a little supper to top off the wedding festivities. And Grandpapa sat at the head of the table, with Mother Fisher at the other end, and Dr. Fisher and Mrs. Whitney opposite in the centre. And there were wedding toasts and little speeches, and everybody got very jolly and festive. And the little doctor looked down to the table end where he could see his wife's eyes. "It reminds me very much of our own wedding day, wife," his glance said. And she smiled back in such a way as to fill him with great content. "And wasn't that reception in the school parlors too perfectly beautiful for anything?" cried Polly Pepper, in a lull, for about the 50th time the remark had been made. "Yes, and didn't Alexia make an awful blunder with her paper of rice?" said Clem sweetly. "I can't help it," said Alexia, nowise disturbed. "The old paper burst, and I had to put it in my handkerchief. You couldn't expect me, girls, to keep my wits after that." "Well, you needn't have spilt it all over Miss Anstice's bonnet," said Philena, laughing. "Mrs. Clemcy's, you mean," corrected Jasper. "Oh dear me, I never shall get used to her new name," declared Philena. "And I think I got my rice deposited as well as some of the rest of you girls," declared Alexia airily. "Mine struck Mr. Clemcy full in the eye," said Sylvia. "Then I ducked behind Polly Pepper." "Oh, that was a great way to do!" exclaimed Jasper. "Oh, I saw her," said Polly with a little laugh, "and I jumped away, and Mr. Clemcy saw her too." "Horrors!" cried Sylvia. "Did he? Oh, I'm frightened to death. What did he look like, Polly?" "Oh, he laughed," said Polly. Just then came a ring at the doorbell, sharp and sudden. "What is going to happen?" cried Polly, her face like a rose. "Everything has been beautiful today, and now I just know something perfectly lovely is coming to finish off with." "A telegram, sir." Johnson held out a long yellow envelope to Mr. King. "It's for Mrs. Fisher," said the old gentleman. So the yellow envelope went down the table length, the color going out of Polly's cheek, and she didn't dare look at Mumsie's eyes. "Oh, the boys!" gasped Polly. "Jasper, do you suppose—" What she didn't finish, for Mother Fisher just then cried out, and passed the yellow sheet to the little doctor. "Read it aloud," was all she said. But how her black eyes shone! "David took first prize classics. I'm picking up a bit. Joel Pepper." The end. End of chapter 25. End of 5 Little Peppers at School, by Margaret Sidney. Recording by Rachel. 2015.